In the year 1162, on the Mongolian plateau, there were no city walls, no written language, and no one could foresee that this vast grassland would shake the entire known world half a century later. In a yurt by the Annan River, a baby was born. His father was Yasuge, chief of the Kya tribe, and his mother was Holen, a bride taken by force. This baby was named Temujin. In time, the whole world would come to know him by another name, Genghis Khan. But for now, he was just one of countless newborns on the grassland, and no one would halt their horses for his birth. The wind of the steppe blew as usual, and nothing had changed. Regarding the birth of Temujin, Faithi's secret history of the Mongols, Fei records a vivid legend. At his birth, his right hand tightly clutched a solidified blood clot, shaped like a knucklebone. In Mongolian belief, this was a mark of divine mandate, a sign reserved for those chosen by heaven. It should be noted that historians generally regard this as a mythological narrative added later, rather than fact. But legends exist because people need a starting point for an incredible destiny. Temujin's fate, indeed, required an extraordinary beginning. A baby holding a blood clot, as if declaring from birth, "I have arrived," bearing violence and divine mandate. Yasuge, Temujin's father, was a Batar, a warrior, of the Kya tribe. He was not the most powerful chieftain on the steppe, but his bravery and cunning earned him a place within the tribal confederation. Yasuge is best known for an incident on the road, where he encountered a man from the Merkit tribe traveling with his newly-wed wife. Captivated by the woman's beauty, Yasuge and his brothers charged forward and seized her. This abducted woman was Holen, Temujin's mother. Marriage on the steppe was steeped in violence from the very beginning, and Temujin's life, too, began in violence. This debt would later be repaid in the form of war. Temujin's childhood was not particularly tragic, at least in the early years. As the son of a chieftain, he followed his father's tribe, migrating and herding around the Kent Mountains. He learned to ride horses, shoot arrows, and survive in the harsh winters, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. There were no greenhouses for Mongolian children. The grasslands themselves were the harshest teachers. From a young age, Temujin displayed a silence and observational skill beyond his years. He was not the strongest child, but he was always watching, listening, and remembering every word spoken by everyone. This ability would later become his most formidable weapon. Like a young wolf, he quietly learned the rules of the world. When Temujin was about 9 years old, Yasuge took him to the Ongarat tribe to seek a marriage. On the way, they passed the camp of Di-Seken, the chief of the Kongarat tribe. Di-Seken had a daughter named Bi-Fei-Arti, who was a year older than Temujin. Yasuge recognized the extraordinary character of the girl and immediately proposed marriage. According to the customs of the steppe, Temujin was left in his father-in-law's home to live with Bi-Ferti. Yasuge set off alone on the return journey. He did not know that this would be the last time he saw his son safe. Fate had already set a trap on the road. The path home would become a road to death. The departure of a father was about to rewrite the entire life of a child. Yasuge was on his way back when he passed by the camp of the Tatars. The Tatar tribe and the Kyan tribe had the deepest enmity, and Yasuge had once captured their chieftain. The Tatars recognized him, outwardly offering warm hospitality while secretly poisoning his food. After leaving, Yasuge felt severe abdominal pain and struggled to ride back to his camp, sending someone to fetch Temujin. By the time 9-year-old Temujin reached his father's side, Yasuge was already on the brink of death. A child knelt by his father's bed, watching the mightiest protector on the steppe gradually lose his breath under the torment of poison. The world collapsed in that moment. The one who had shielded him from everything would never stand again. Yasuge's death was more than just the loss of a father. In the power dynamics of the steppe, the death of a leader meant a complete reshuffling of the deck. Yasuge's followers quickly weighed their options. Follow a 9-year-old child or pledge allegiance to a stronger tribe. The answer was harsh and pragmatic. The Taichut clan was the first to act, declaring they no longer recognized the status of Yasuge's family. One by one, the herders drove away their livestock, dismantled their felt tents, and joined the departing crowd. Temujin stood on the hillside, watching his father's followers recede like a retreating tide. Those who had bowed to his father just yesterday would not spare him so much as a backward glance today. The most brutal scene unfolded on the morning the tribe broke camp. Feien charged into the crowd on horseback, holding Yesfege's war banner, shouting herself hoarse. You swore an oath to Yesfege. You cannot abandon his children. But no one stopped. An old woman glanced back at her, then turned and continued walking. The wheels of the ox carts rolled over the grassland, growing ever more distant. When the last felled tent vanished over the horizon, the world was left with only Fei and her few children. Standing on the vast empty steppe, surrounded by nothing but a few old horses and the approaching winter. This was the first time the world abandoned Temujin, but it would not be the last. On the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, being abandoned by one's tribe was almost equivalent to a death sentence. The grasslands were no place for a person to survive alone. Blizzards could wipe out all livestock overnight. Wolf packs attacked isolated herders, and other tribes viewed the unprotected as prey to be plundered at will. Feien, with her 5 biological sons and 2 stepchildren, had no tribal protection, insufficient livestock, and no adult male support. By the logic of the steppe, they should have perished in the first winter. All odds pointed to destruction. But Fei was no ordinary woman. In her veins flowed a will to survive more tenacious than that of any warrior on the grasslands. Holen, originally from the Ongerat tribe, was a woman of unwavering determination. Even before her forced marriage, faced with overwhelming disaster, she displayed astonishing survival instincts. She moved her children along the Onan River, gathering wild leeks, digging up roots, and catching small fish. She taught Temujin and his brothers to make fishhooks from bone needles and weave nets from horsehair. Every meal was wrested from the very teeth of the earth, and each day survived was a small victory over fate. Temujin would later conquer half the world, but his first hero was not any warrior. It was this woman who refused to die in the face of despair. With her own hands, she showed her son, as long as you do not give up, the steppe cannot kill you. A widely circulated story, Howland caught her sons before her, handed them a single arrow to break, and it snapped easily. Then she took 5 arrows bound together. No one could break them, she said. Brothers fighting are like a single arrow easily broken. United, no one can defeat you. Whether this story is entirely true is impossible to verify. But it reveals a core truth. Temujin's first lesson from his mother was not how to fight, but how to unite. This was precisely the fundamental key to his future conquest of the world. The lesson of the 5 arrows would extend from a broken family to the foundation of an empire. But unity is not natural. Hunger is the cruelest test, capable of turning even the closest kin into enemies. Temujin had a half-brother named Bektar, who, being older, often snatched the fish and game that Temujin and his younger brother Kasar had caught. This was no ordinary sibling quarrel. In the wilderness, where every bite of food meant life or death, having your food stolen meant being stripped of your right to survive. Temujin endured it again and again, his anger silently building. A young boy's rage is not diluted by reason, like an adult's. It is pure scolding, and ultimately unstoppable. That string was pulled tighter and tighter. The day finally arrived. Temujin and Kassar, armed with bows and arrows, quietly approached Bektar, who was herding on the hillside. Seeing them approach, Bektar might have sensed something from their eyes. He did not flee, nor did he resist. He sat calmly and uttered a single sentence. "With so many enemies out there, why are you turning against your own brother?" But Temujin did not hesitate. 2 arrows pierced Bektar's body from front and back. A young boy had killed his own brother. The first drop of blood on the grassland was shed within the family. This choice struck like a bolt of lightning, cleaving his life forever after. Upon hearing this, Helen was furious. She bitterly scolded Temujin and Kassar. "You have no friends but your own shadows, no whips but horses' tails. You are even worse than dogs." Helen's anger was not merely a mother's instinctive fear of killing, but a sober judgment. In their extremely vulnerable situation, infighting was the most foolish act. Yet Temujin endured his mother's wrath in silence. He had already made his choice, a choice that would define his entire life. He would not tolerate anyone threatening his survival, even if that person shared his blood. Silence was his only answer to his mother. The killing of Bektar cast an indelible shadow over Temujin's life. This was his first lesson in power. Power is not given, but seized, sometimes at the cost of the blood of one's closest kin. Many historians have attempted to defend or condemn, but what matters more is understanding. In that era and under those circumstances, an abandoned boy faced extremely limited choices: to endure and slowly perish from hunger, or to establish his position through violence. He chose the latter. This was not a matter of good or evil, but of survival or destruction. The steppe does not need good people. The steppe needs those who survive. Another pivotal event in Temujin's youth was his capture by the Taichu tribe, the very people who had abandoned them years earlier. Hearing that Yesfege's son was growing up, they feared he might one day seek revenge and sent cavalry to raid Temujin's family camp. Amid the chaos, Temujin tried to flee into the forest but was pursued and captured. The Taichut placed a wooden kang around his neck and hands, a heavy punishment device that made it impossible for him to eat or drink on his own, leaving him entirely dependent on the guard's mercy. A free child of the steppe was reduced to a prisoner, treated like livestock. Those who had once cast him aside now sought to destroy him. The wooden kang was one of the most humiliating punishments on the steppe. Those who wore it not only lost their freedom, but also their dignity. Displayed before the crowd, pelted with stones by children, and made into living proof of the tribe's power. Temujin was paraded in this manner at the Taichu camp, where his father's former followers took pleasure in shaming him. Yet, in such circumstances, Temujin displayed a disquieting composure. He did not weep or beg for mercy, but instead used his dark eyes to memorize every face that mocked him and every hand that threw a stone. This silence was more terrifying than any roar. He was quietly compiling a list, one that would inevitably be settled in the future. The escape took place on a moonlit night. The Taichi tribe was holding a feast, and the guards were lax. Seizing the opportunity, Temujin struck down a guard with his wooden kang and fled into the darkness, still burdened by the heavy shackles. He hid in the shallow waters of the Onan River with only his nose and mouth above the surface to breathe, the buoyancy of the wooden kang keeping him from sinking. The torches of the pursuers swept back and forth along the riverbank, while he remained motionless in the icy water, awaiting either death or freedom. The fear and willpower of that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. The river was cold, but his heart burned with a single thought: I will not die here, never. While on the run, a herdsman named Sorkan Shira discovered Temujin hiding in a river. This ordinary man made an extraordinary decision. Instead of reporting him to the Taiyichud, he hid Temujin in a cart filled with wool inside his tent. His sons helped Temujin break free from his wooden keng, providing him with food and a horse. Why would a common herdsman risk the lives of his entire family to help a fugitive? Perhaps because he saw something in Temujin's eyes, or perhaps it was simply out of kindness. Temujin never forgot this man later. After unifying the steppe, he bestowed the highest honors upon Sorkunshira. He never forgot a kindness, just as he never forgot a grudge. When Temujin returned to his mother with scars and hatred, he was no longer the abandoned child, captured, shackled, and escaped. These experiences forged him like fire. He now knew three things. First, the world shows no mercy to the weak, only deeper trampling. Second, even in the darkest moments, there are those who will help you, and these people are more trustworthy than blood ties. Third, he must become strong, not to seek revenge against anyone, but to never again become a prisoner under someone else's shackles. These three realizations formed the cornerstone of the philosophy of the future Genghis Khan's empire. The awakening of a prisoner would become the charter of an empire. In Temujin's youth, there was another crucial relationship, his friendship with Jamukha. Jamukha was a boy from the Jataran tribe, about the same age as Temujin, and they had known each other since childhood. They played knucklebones together on frozen rivers and exchanged small gifts. In the culture of the steppe, boys could become Anda sworn brothers through rituals, a bond considered theoretically stronger than blood ties. Temujin and Jamukha became Anda 3 times, each time with deeper vows. At the time, the two boys could not have imagined that they would later become the most formidable rivals on the steppe. The closest friendships often brew the most brutal ruptures. The Anda Oath is one of the most sacred covenants in Mongolian culture. Two individuals exchange gifts, drink blood wine together, and swear to the eternal blue sky never to betray each other. When they first became Anda, Temujin gave Jamukha a copper anklebone, and Jamukha gifted him one made of deer antler in return. They chased each other across the frozen surface of the Onong River, their laughter echoing across the winter grassland. This was one of the few purely joyful memories in Temujin's life. In a world filled with betrayal and violence, having someone willing to say to you, "I will always stand by your side," was more precious than any wealth. Sadly, on the grasslands, nothing lasts forever. It is only a matter of sooner or later. By his teenage years, Temujin's character had become unmistakably clear. He was not the strongest youth. His brother Kasar was the better archer, and Belgutai the better wrestler. But Temujin possessed a unique ability to make others want to serve him. He spoke little, yet his words carried weight. He held grudges, but remembered kindness even more. He could be utterly ruthless, yet fiercely loyal. Above all, he had an almost animal-like intuition for discerning who could be trusted and who would ultimately become an enemy. This talent for reading people was more lethal than any martial skill. He did not need to be the strongest himself. He only needed to find the strongest. The Mongolian steppe gave Temujin a unique education. There were no books, no schools, but there were lessons far harsher than any textbook. The steppe taught him to read the weather. The shape of dark clouds determined whether to move camp. It taught him to track prey. The depth of hoofprints revealed how long ago a herd had passed. It taught him to understand power. In a wolf pack, only the strongest ate, but a lone wolf never survived a winter. Temujin later built an unprecedented military system, not because he had read any treatise on warfare, but because he distilled the laws of survival on the steppe into the principles of war. The steppe was his military academy. Hunger and death were his instructors. Howland's influence on Temujin extended far beyond mere survival skills. as a woman who had been abducted in marriage, abandoned, and survived against all odds. She possessed an exceptionally clear understanding of how power operated on the steppe. She told Temujin, "Your father failed, not because he lacked courage, but because he trusted the wrong people." She said, "The loyalty of tribes is like the rivers on the grassland. They flow with you when the water is high, but change course when it runs low." She also said, "Do not hate those who abandoned us. Instead, make yourself so strong that they have no choice but to return." These words were etched into Temujin's bones, forming the foundation of all his decisions. His mother's wisdom proved far more profound than his father's bravery. In the years following their abandonment, the family of Temujin, though impoverished, was not entirely isolated. Hulan's resilience attracted a handful of marginalized herders to join them. Temujin also demonstrated leadership qualities. He distributed game fairly, kept every promise, and repaid those who helped him with double the kindness. Gradually, a small but exceptionally loyal inner circle formed around this young man. These initial followers, including the later four great generals, Borchu, Mughali, Boraku, and Qilang, would become the pillars of the Mongol Empire. Great endeavors often begin in the most unremarkable corners. The seeds of an empire were hidden within a few worn felt tents. The story of Bifearti is the best footnote to Temujin's early leadership. When the few horses owned by Temujin's family were stolen, he set out alone to track down the thieves. Along the way, he encountered the young Bifearti, who was milking horses at his father's pasture. Upon hearing of Temujin's plight, Bifearti immediately mounted his horse and joined the pursuit without even returning home to inform his father. They successfully recovered the horses, and from that moment on, Bifearti became Temujin's most loyal companion, never leaving his side until the end of his life. The intuitive trust of one young man in another laid the very foundation of an empire. Sometimes, the first brick of an empire is the courage of a stranger stepping forward. Examining Temujin's childhood within a broader historical framework reveals a striking pattern. Nearly all individuals who reshaped the world order experienced a phase of being utterly abandoned by the existing system. This abandonment was not only painful but also liberating. When one has nothing left in the old order, there is no reason to uphold it. The very reason Temujin was later able to dismantle the millennia-old tribal kinship system of the steppes was because this system had never given him anything. Those rejected by the establishment often possess the greatest drive to rebuild it. This is a paradox repeatedly proven by history. The destroyers are often the very outcasts created by the old order itself. At the end of this chapter, let us return to that scene. A 9-year-old boy stands on an empty grassland, watching the last ox cart disappear beyond the horizon. His father is dead, his tribe has abandoned him, and the rules of the entire world tell him, "You do not deserve to live." Yet he survives. Not only does he survive, but through hunger, betrayal, and captivity, he accumulates a terrifying power. This power is not the strength of muscles, but the power of understanding. He has seen the truth of this world with absolute clarity. Loyalty can be bought, blood ties are unreliable, and only strength and order can truly keep a person safe. This realization is priceless. Genghis Khan was not answering how to conquer the world, but rather a more primal question: how a man abandoned by the world could rewrite it with order and violence. This answer began on the afternoon. His mother taught him to break an arrow, became irreversible the moment he shot his brother, and found its direction on the night he held his breath in the icy river. The orphan of the steppe did not yet know that he was about to embark on a path of no return. In the next chapter, he would face love, loss, and revenge. That would be the true starting point of his rise. The storm was coming, and he was already prepared. Temujin had grown up. The boy who once dug for roots to stave off hunger on the steppe had become a silent, alert young man with sharp eyes. Around him gathered a small band of loyal companions. Yet, he remained one of the weakest chieftains on the grasslands. However, one thing had never changed. He always remembered the girl named Bifurte. The childhood betrothal was like a thread weaving through all the years of hardship, pulling him toward the most important woman in his destiny. Now, it was time to bring her back. He prepared his horse, took his brother, and set out on the journey to claim his bride. Temujin took his younger brothers to the Hongjila tribe to marry Bifurte II, honored the promise he had made to Yasuge years ago, and gave his daughter's hand to this young man, who had almost nothing. The most precious item in Bifurte's dowry was a black sable fur cloak, a treasure on the grasslands that could be exchanged for an entire army. Looking at the cloak, Temujin already had a plan in mind. He would not trade it for horses or sheep. He intended to exchange it for something far more important. A powerful ally. Marriage had given him a wife, and it had also given him a key to unlock the future. Temujin took a black sable cloak to meet Wang Khan, one of the most powerful figures on the steppe and the leader of the Kare tribe. Wang Khan and Yasuge had sworn an Anda blood brotherhood during Yasuge's lifetime. And according to steppe tradition, Temujin could address him as his adoptive father. Temujin presented the cloak and respectfully said, "I am the son of your Anda. Please protect me as a father would." Wang Khan accepted the generous gift and agreed to become Temujin's protector. A single fur cloak had secured an ally of imperial stature. This was Temujin's first display of political talent. He understood that, on the steppe, courage alone was not enough for survival. One also had to know how to leverage strength. A brief peace descended. Temujin and Borte made their home by the Onan River. Though their tent was humble, these days were among the rare moments of tranquility in Temujin's life. Borte was not only beautiful, but also wise and steady. She managed the camp for Temujin, comforted the families of his followers, and served as a stable core within this fragile little community. While Temujin built alliances and recruited followers outside, Borte maintained order within. They were like two pillars holding up a tent that could be blown down by the wind at any moment. But peace on the steppe never lasted long. Disaster was approaching. The calamity came from a sworn enemy Temujin had never seen, but was destined to be entangled with for life. The Merkit tribe. Remember Yasuge, Temujin's father. He had once stolen Holen, a woman of the Merkit people. The Merkits never forgot this humiliation. Now, upon hearing that Yasuge's son had taken a wife, they decided to retaliate in kind. By seizing Temujin's bride, a father's atrocity committed over 2 decades earlier was now to be repaid by his son. Hatred on the steppe does not fade with time. It only ferments in silence, awaiting the cruelest moment to erupt. The raid occurred just before dawn. The Merkit cavalry surged like a tide toward Temujin's camp. Tents were overturned, flames leaped into the air, and screams tore through the night sky, awakened in the chaos by the cries of an old woman. Temujin leaped onto his horse and fled desperately toward Mount Burhan with his mother and younger brothers. But in the confusion, he made a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He did not take Bifurte with him. There were only a few horses in the camp, and too many people. Bifurte and Temujin's maid, Sako, were left behind. When Temujin looked back, he saw his wife being dragged onto a horse by the Merkit warriors. Temujin fled to Mount Burhan. He was safe. But his wife was in the hands of the enemy. This was a humiliation deeper than death. In the culture of the steppe, a man who could not protect his woman was declaring his weakness to the world. Temujin knelt in the dense forest of Mount Burhan, praying to the eternal blue sky for 3 days and 3 nights. He was not begging for a miracle, but suppressing fear and despair, transforming them into cold determination. On the mountain, he made a vow. I will take her back, no matter the cost. This mountain saved his life and witnessed his oath. There is limited historical documentation regarding Bifurti's experiences after her abduction, but it is certain that she was handed over to a man from the Merkit tribe. This followed the Merkit's logic of revenge. Your father took our women, so now we take yours. In that era, women were treated as bargaining chips and trophies in intertribal conflicts, and their suffering was rarely recorded in history. However, during her captivity, Bifurti displayed remarkable resilience. She did not break down because she knew Timthejin would come her. This trust was not blind. She understood her husband. Well, the man who had once escaped from a wooden kang would never give up. After descending the mountain, Temujin immediately sprang into action. His first move was not to gather his own meager few dozen followers, but to seek out Ongkan, kneeling before his adoptive father. He swallowed all his pride and pleaded for assistance. Moved by his sincerity, Ongkan agreed to send 20,000 troops. Yet, Temujin knew it was not enough, so he turned to his sworn brother Jamuka. By then, Jamuka had become the leader of the Jadaran tribe, commanding a formidable force upon hearing Temujin's request. He promptly pledged 10,000 soldiers. The three forces were about to unite into a sharp blade, aimed straight at the heart of the Merkits. This was Temujin's first true military campaign in his life, and also the first time he learned the most crucial lesson of war: leveraging strength. His own power was insignificant, but he could make the strong fight for him. Wang Khan sent troops out of friendship as sworn brothers, and the favor owed for the black sable coat. Jamuka sent troops due to brotherly bonds and shared hatred for the Merkits. Temujin transformed a personal humiliation into a joint operation driven by multiple interests. This ability to turn his own needs into the needs of others would become the core skill of his future conquest of the world. 30,000 cavalry advanced through the night toward the Merkit camp Temfejin. Ongkan and Jamuka closed in from 3 directions. The Merkits had never anticipated a strike of such magnitude. They believed that seizing a woman was merely a minor tribal skirmish, not worth a full-scale war. This was their fatal miscalculation. As the Mongol horsemen stormed into the camp like a tempest, the Merkits were thrown into complete disarray before they could organize any resistance. Felt tents burned in the flames, livestock scattered in panic, and the Merkits were hunted down one by one in the darkness. The hooves of vengeance crushed everything in their path. Amid the chaos of the night battle, Temujin had only one goal: to find Bifurt. He rode through the burning camp, calling his wife's name again and again. The battlefield was filled with fleeing crowds and fallen bodies, the firelight casting everything in a hellish red glow. At last, he heard a voice, a woman calling his name from within the chaotic crowd. Bifurti jumped down from an ox cart and stumbled toward him through the darkness. Temujin leaped from his horse and held his wife tightly. In that moment, the whole world seemed to belong only to the two of them. Borte was rescued. However, an unavoidable fact lay before them. She had been in the hands of the Merkits for several months, and she was pregnant. Whose child was in her womb? Temujin's or a Merkit is? This question would fester like a poisonous thorn in the heart of Temujin's family for decades. Shortly after Borte's return, she gave birth to her first son. Temujin named him Jochi, meaning guest. The name itself was a hint, a silent wound. The mystery of Jochi's lineage would become one of the most fatal fissures in the future Mongol Empire. Temujin never publicly questioned Jochi's lineage. He accepted the child as his eldest son, granting him the same status as his other sons. This was a deliberate political decision, and also a protection for Borte. However, among the Mongol nobility, whispers about Jochi's bloodline never ceased. In the future, during a quarrel, his second son Chagatai would call Jochi the seed of the Merkits to his face, forcing Temujin to angrily intervene. The violence a woman endured in war became an unhealable wound in the succession of imperial power. The cruelty of history often hides in the most private corners. But at present, victory brings tangible rewards. The Merkit tribe was crushed, with vast numbers of livestock, slaves, and equipment seized. More importantly, this battle spread Tem Feijin's name across the steppe for the first time. A young man capable of organizing an allied force of 30,000 and achieving a great victory was no longer a minor figure to be ignored. Followers flocked from all directions, some opportunistic, seeing a chance, others genuinely admiring his courage. Tem Feijin's influence swelled rapidly after the battle. Every victory served as the best recruitment advertisement. The people of the steppe voted with their feet, choosing to follow the winner. This battle also allowed Temujin to witness, for the first time, the true potential of the Mongol cavalry. 30,000 cavalrymen, without maps or communication devices, coordinated a three-pronged night assault and executed a precise encirclement. Such mobility and execution were unimaginable for armies of settled civilizations. Temujin keenly realized that, if this power could be better organized and commanded, it would become unstoppable. This thought, like a seed, was planted in his mind. Years later, when he established the 1,000-household system and unified the Mongol military structure, this seed would grow into a towering tree that would change the world. After the war, Temujin did something that surprised everyone. He treated the ordinary herders of the Merkit tribe with kindness. He did not slaughter women and children, but instead integrated them into his own tribe. This was extremely rare on the steppes at the time, as most leaders would either sell the defeated as slaves or execute them all. Temujin's logic was different. Killing them only yields corpses, but incorporating them gives you warriors, herders, and livestock. This ability to turn enemies into allies was one of his most formidable weapons. Swords can eliminate foes, but only a broad mind can turn enemies into followers. Meanwhile, the relationship between Temujin and Jamukha entered a honeymoon phase. After the war, the two reaffirmed their Anda oath and decided to merge their camps to live together. The two tribes combined, greatly increasing their strength and temporarily becoming a force to be reckoned with on the steppe. Temujin and Jamukha ate and lived together, inseparable like blood brothers. On the surface, this seemed like a perfect alliance, but cracks were already growing in the shadows. Two equally intelligent and ambitious men living in the same camp were like two male lions sharing a territory, peaceful in the short term, but inevitably clashing in the long run. The rift between Temujin and Jamukha was not a clash of personalities, but a conflict of philosophies. Jamukha was a believer in the traditional order of the steppe. He held that noble blood determined status and that tribal hierarchies were unbreakable. Temujin was the complete opposite. He believed that ability decided everything, and that the son of a slave, if strong enough, deserved to be a general. These two worldviews collided in every daily decision. Who should receive more livestock? Who should occupy the seat of honor at a feast? How should the mistakes of whose subordinates be punished? Each small issue was a rehearsal for a great divide. The distance between the brothers quietly widened amidst their laughter. There are multiple versions of the spark that led to the split, but the core conflict remains the same. More and more people chose to follow Tem Feijin rather than Jamukha. Tem Feijin treated every follower fairly, regardless of their background, valuing only ability and loyalty. In contrast, although Jamukha was equally brave and intelligent, he insisted on distributing power according to bloodline and status. The herders made their choice in the simplest way, quietly dismantling their felt tents at night and moving with their livestock to Tem Feijin's camp. The hearts of the people are the most honest river on the grassland, always flowing toward the direction that promises a better life. Watching his followers slip away, Jamukha burned with rage. Temujin and Jamukha ultimately parted ways. Regarding the specific scene of their separation, the account in Faithi's Secret History of the Mongols, Fei carries a literary flair. During a camp relocation, Jamukha uttered a meaningful remark, and Bifete advised Temujin. This man's words carried hidden implications. It was time for them to leave. That night, Temujin departed Jamukha's camp with his followers under the cover of darkness. The Bondavanda had reached its end. The two, who had exchanged knucklebones on the frozen river in their youth, now rode off in opposite directions across the steppe. From then on, they were destined to become each other's sworn enemies. It is noteworthy to consider the role of Bifearti in this division. She was not only Tem Feijin's wife, but also his most trusted political advisor. At critical moments, it was her keen awareness of Jamukha's hostility that prompted her to advise her husband to act immediately, from being captured to being rescued, from enduring humiliation to rebuilding her life. Bifurti's insight into human nature had been honed to a razor's edge. While Tem Feijin made decisions on the battlefield, Bifurti made judgments in the tent. Their partnership was not a simple division of labor between husband and wife, but a true strategic alliance. She was his eyes, his ears, and his second mind. After the split, Temujin set up his own camp, having gathered a considerable number of followers. He did something unprecedented. He convened a tribal assembly, allowing his followers to elect him as Khan. This was not the traditional way of succession on the steppe, where the position of Khan was determined by lineage and seniority. But Temujin's authority came from below, from the support of those who had willingly chosen to follow him. It was a small-scale experiment in democracy, and the first public declaration of Temujin's political philosophy. My power is not inherited from my ancestors, but earned through your trust. However, the election of Temujin as Khan provoked intense hostility from Jamukha. In Jamukha's eyes, Temujin was merely the descendant of an orphan abandoned by his tribe, unworthy of the title of Khan. What infuriated him even more was that many of his former followers had now sided with Temujin. A mix of jealousy, anger, and a sense of betrayal drove Jamukha to plot his revenge. The two sharpest minds on the steppe were about to clash head. On the deeper their friendship in youth, the fiercer their hatred in adulthood. The war between them would erupt in full force in the next chapter. Looking back at Chapter 2, Temujin experienced the most intense emotional upheavals of his life. The sweetness of a new marriage, the humiliation of his wife being abducted, the exhilaration of revenge, the hidden pain of bloodline and kinship, and the bitterness of a brotherly rift. Yet, from each blow, he extracted something useful. From Bifearti's abduction, he learned to leverage power, trading a black sable pelt for an alliance of 30,000 troops. From the night raid on the Merkits, he grasped the might of blitzkrieg tactics. From integrating defeated enemies, he discovered how to turn foes into strength. From his split with Jamukha, he realized that people's hearts matter more than swords. Every scar became a lesson learned. Borte's significance in this chapter far exceeds that of a rescued wife. She was the catalyst for Temujin's political awakening. For her sake, Temujin learned for the first time how to forge alliances, organize large-scale military operations, and manage the distribution of post-war benefits. Without the incident of Borte's abduction, Temujin might have lived out his life in obscurity on the fringes of the steppe. In a sense, the atrocities committed by the Merkids not only failed to destroy Temujin, but instead propelled him onto the path to becoming a ruler. The cruelty of fate lies in this. The deepest wounds often serve as the greatest driving force. How does a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? In this chapter, the answer begins to take shape. First, use humiliation to ignite rage. Then harness that rage with reason. And finally, turn rage into power through victory. Tem Feijin is not a revenge-driven avenger. He is a man who can transform anger into a strategic resource. This is what makes him truly terrifying. In the next chapter, he will face the most agonizing confrontation of his life. The fateful battle with his sworn brother Jamuka. It will be the ultimate clash of friendship, betrayal, and two opposing worldviews. The steppe is about to be stained with blood. Once the closest of companions on the steppe, two men now stood facing each other across a desolate wilderness. Tem Feijin and Jamuka, sworn brothers who had exchanged knucklebones on the frozen river in their youth, now commanded tens of thousands of followers each, standing on irreconcilable opposing sides. This was not a conflict born of misunderstanding, but the ultimate clash between two fundamentally different worldviews. One sought to uphold the millennia-old order of noble bloodlines on the steppe, while the other aimed to replace it entirely with ability and loyalty. The steppe was not vast enough to hold two sons. From this moment on, only one path remained between them, to determine the victor with the survivor writing the rules. To grasp the depth of this rupture, one must return to the fundamental differences between the two men. Jamuka was born into the aristocratic lineage of the Jadaran tribe, raised with the creed that bloodline determined everything, that nobles were born to rule over herders and slaves. This order had maintained the stability of the steppe for millennia, and Jamuka was its most steadfast defender. In contrast, Temujin had been mercilessly cast aside by this same order since childhood. His followers included escaped slaves, herders who had lost their tribes, and marginalized exiles. His promise was strikingly simple: follow me, and your status will be determined by your abilities, not by who your father was. This was an open declaration of war against the old world. Jamuka was the first to strike. He united 13 tribes on the steppe that were hostile to Temujin, assembling a coalition force of 30,000 men, known as the 13 Wings. Jamuka's justification was grand and righteous. Temujin was a rebel who disrupted the ancient order of the steppe, a madman who allowed slaves to rise above nobles, and he had to be eradicated. But what truly drove Jamuka was something more personal than politics: jealousy and the fury of betrayal. The followers who had once drunk and danced with him had quietly defected to Temujin, one after another. This loss pained him more than any defeat on the battlefield. Wars between sworn brothers are always the cruelest, for the depth of hatred equals the depth of the love that once existed. The Battle of the 13 Wings erupted. This was the first major defeat in Tem Feijin's life that held true significance. Jamuka's allied forces held a clear advantage in both numbers and organizational coordination. Tem Feijin's troops were routed after intense clashes, forcing them to retreat into the narrow gorge area upstream of the Onan River. The defeat was total. Tem Feijin lost a significant number of warriors and livestock, and his power suffered a heavy blow. If the story had ended there, Tem Feijin would have been just another name among countless failed chieftains on the steppe, buried by wild grass and oblivion. But victory or defeat on the battlefield is never the whole story. What truly determines the course of fate was quietly unfolding beyond the battlefield. Jamuka won the battle but lost the hearts of the people. After his victory, he did something that shocked the entire steppe. He ordered the captured enemy leaders to be thrown alive into 70 large cauldrons of boiling water to be cooked to death. This was not a battlefield slaughter, but a cruel performance by the victor against the vanquished. The sound of boiling water, the piercing screams, and the nauseating smell that permeated the entire camp. This scene was witnessed and spread to every corner of the steppe. Jamaka sought to consolidate his authority through extreme fear, but he gravely misjudged the direction of people's hearts. Fear can make people bow and obey temporarily, but only genuine trust can make them willingly follow. After the news spread, the reactions of the various tribes on the steppe completely defied Jamaka's expectations. Instead of being intimidated into submission, people began to fearfully distance themselves from this brutal victor. Who could guarantee that a leader capable of such acts against defeated captives would not one day do the same to his own followers? Herders whispered around their campfires at night, while commanders exchanged worried glances in their respective tents. In contrast, though defeated, Temujin treated captives and his followers entirely differently. He never slaughtered those who surrendered, kept every promise he made, and distributed all spoils of war fairly. The contrast between the two leadership styles became strikingly clear at that moment. In those difficult days of rebuilding after defeat, Temujin received a letter that could change the course of his fate. The letter came from a high-ranking general in Jamaka's camp, conveying the message: "I can no longer follow a leader who boils people alive in a cauldron. I am willing to serve a man who treats strangers like brothers until my dying day." This letter was not an isolated case. More and more tribal chiefs and mid-level commanders began to contact Temujin through secret channels, expressing their desire to pledge allegiance. Temujin had lost a battle on the battlefield, but he had won an entire war in the hearts of the people. He finally understood a crucial truth. Over the next few years, Temujin rebuilt his power with astonishing patience and restraint. He did not rush into a war of revenge, but instead focused all his energy on expanding and consolidating his foundation. With each new tribe that pledged allegiance, he personally oversaw the details, breaking up the original tribal kinship structures and reassigning positions and pastures based on individual ability. A former slave who performed well could be promoted to a commander of 100 households, while a noble-born playboy with no talent was only fit for herding. This approach infuriated the traditional nobility, but attracted droves of common herders and warriors. Temujin was quietly laying the groundwork. During the reconstruction process, Temujin's core team gradually took shape. Borshu, Mukali, Boroku, and Chilawun latter, known as the four great generals of the Mongol Empire, all established their positions during this critical phase. None of them came from prominent noble families on the steppe. Borshu was the son of an ordinary herder. Mukali hailed from a conquered minor tribe, and Chilawun had even once been a prisoner of war from an enemy camp. Temujin never inquired about one's background when selecting talent. He valued only loyalty and practical ability. This approach was considered unconventional in the rigidly hierarchical steppe society of the time. Yet, it was precisely this philosophy of breaking conventions in talent selection that forged his core leadership. The contest between Temujin and Jamaka was not a single decisive duel, but a protracted and comprehensive war of attrition. The two sides clashed repeatedly across the vast grasslands, each experiencing victories and defeats. Their spheres of influence resembled two colliding and pressing clouds, constantly expanding and contracting. Yet, the overall trend became increasingly clear. Temujin's followers steadily grew in number, while Jamaka's dwindled. Thousands of ordinary herders on the grasslands made their simple choice to follow the leader who promised them fairer treatment. History is often recounted as the legendary feats of heroes, but it is the collective choices of countless ordinary people that truly drive its course. While engaged in a prolonged conflict with Jamaka, Temujin also had to address another increasingly thorny issue: the delicate and dangerous relationship with his sworn father. Khan was the leader of the Kari tribe, commanding one of the most formidable military forces on the steppe. For years, Temujin had served him with the reverence of a dutiful son, leading troops into battle and helping quell internal rebellions within the tribe. However, as Temujin's own power continued to grow, Khan's heart became filled with suspicion and unease. Was this sworn son, now more powerful and ambitious than himself, a shield or a potential threat? Advisors around Khan constantly whispered, "Temujin's ambitions." Khan ultimately chose betrayal. He meticulously set up a treacherous banquet, inviting Temujin under the pretext of discussing a marriage alliance, while secretly deploying ambushes to capture and kill him during the feast. Fortunately, two lowly herders loyal to Temujin learned of the plot in advance and rode through the night at breakneck speed to deliver the secret warning to him. Temujin narrowly escaped with his life, but his heart suffered a blow heavier than any defeat in battle. Khan was his father's sworn brother, the adoptive father he had willingly submitted to, and the ally he had secured by offering a black sable fur cloak. The last elder he thought he could trust had also raised the butcher's knife. From then on, he understood completely in the world of power. There are no fathers or sons, only rivals. The decisive battle between Temujin and Khan erupted across the desolate sands of Karojin Chateau. This was an all-or-nothing gamble for both sides, with no retreat possible. Temujin's forces were numerically inferior to Khan's Kariid army, but his warriors far surpassed their opponents in loyalty and fighting spirit. Khan's men fought out of fear of punishment from their superiors, while Temujin's followers willingly faced death driven by inner conviction and trust in their leader. The brutal conflict raged for 3 full days and nights until the Kariid lines finally collapsed completely. On the 3rd day, Khan fled in panic amidst the defeated troops, ultimately reaching the Naiman territory. After defeating Khan, Temujin did something extremely intriguing. He did not subject the remnants of the Kariid tribe to any form of humiliation or retaliatory purge. Instead, he fully integrated Khan's followers into his own organizational system. He even made a surprising arrangement, marrying Khan's niece to his beloved youngest son, Talui. This was not an act of momentary soft-hearted mercy, but a carefully calculated political integration strategy. Through marriage and systematic incorporation, Temujin transformed a once powerful enemy, capable of threatening him, into a part of his own strength in an instant: the Kariid tribe. Now only 2 major rivals remained on the steppe: Temujin and the Naiman tribe, which controlled the western part of the Mongolian plateau. The Naimans were the closest to settled civilization among the Mongol tribes, possessing their own written language and administrative organization, and their military strength was not to be underestimated. Jamaka, after repeated defeats, had completely lost his base and followers, becoming a political exile wandering from place to place. He eventually sought refuge with the Naiman leader, Taiyang Khan, hoping to make one final stand with his support. Jamaka warned Taiyang Khan Temujin's army was disciplined and resolute, and should not be underestimated. But the arrogant Taiyang Khan paid no heed. His pride was about to cost him his downfall. In the spring of 1204, Temujin gathered all his elite forces and advanced westward, launching the final battle to unify the Mongolian steppe. Before setting out, Temujin made an extremely bold tactical decision, ordering his troops to march swiftly through the wilderness overnight, ensuring they reached the vicinity of the Naiman camp before dawn. After an entire night of uninterrupted, high-speed movement, his army appeared before the Naimans as if out of thin air at the break of dawn, just as the eastern sky began to lighten. From atop the mountain, the Naiman leader, the Sun Khan, looked down upon the endless campfires of Temujin's forces in the distance and asked those around him in alarm. Their campfires are as numerous as the stars in the sky. Just how many troops do they have? In this decisive battle, the Sung Khan was mortally wounded and died, leading to the complete disintegration and dissolution of the once powerful Naiman tribe. Jamukha managed to escape once again amidst the chaos following the defeat. But this time, he had truly reached the end of his road. His followers deserted him one after another, until only 5 loyal companions remained by his side. However, even these 5 men made a cruel decision one late night. They bound the sleeping Jamukha together and delivered him to Temujin's camp, naively hoping to exchange the betrayal of their former lord for rewards and positions from their new master. When he was tightly bound, and after executing the traitor, Temujin and Jamukha finally stood face to face. This was their last conversation in this life, and one of the most stirring scenes in the epic of Mongolia's rise, according to Faithi's Secret History of the Mongols Fei. During this meeting, Temujin solemnly offered Jamukha terms for pardon. If he was willing to become his sworn brother again, all past grievances could be wiped clean. Was this proposal a genuine gesture from the heart or a carefully orchestrated political performance? Historians remain divided on the matter to this day. However, Jamukha's response left no room for debate. He resolutely rejected Temujin's goodwill. Temujin remained silent for a long time before finally agreeing to his Anda's last request. According to the ancient tradition passed down through generations of Mongol nobility, a bloodless death meant execution by strangulation, or breaking the spine. The Mongols believed for generations that blood was the sacred vessel of the soul, and if a person died without shedding blood, their soul could be preserved intact without dissipating. Thus Jamukha ended his magnificent yet tragic life, without shedding a single drop of blood or uttering a single cry of pain. Temujin immediately ordered that his body be buried with full honors in a manner identical to that reserved for his own closest kin. The death of Jamukha marked the complete end of an entire old era on the Mongolian steppe. Throughout his long and brutal confrontation with Temujin, the true core of the debate was never merely about who was qualified to rule the steppe, but rather about how the steppe should operate. The old order represented by Jamukha, where status was determined by lineage, nobility by birth, and aristocratic power was passed down through generations, had persisted on the steppe for over 1,000 years, maintaining its own inherent logic for stability. The new order represented by Temujin, where heroes were judged by their actual abilities, natural barriers of lineage were broken, and talent was selected based on merit, was, despite its revolutionary nature. After defeating the Naiman tribe and bidding farewell to Jamukha, there was no longer any force on the entire Mongolian plateau that could rival Temujin. All the major tribes that had once dominated their respective regions, the Khian, Jadaran, Kerit, Naiman, Tatar, and Merkit, were either completely conquered on the battlefield or voluntarily submitted and were incorporated into Temujin's rule through various means. From the Onon River basin in the far east to the Altai Mountains in the far west. From the shores of Lake Baikal in the north to the edges of the Gobi Desert in the south. This vast and boundless grassland was unified for the first time under the iron will of a single individual. The historical significance of this achievement was unprecedented and unparalleled. In the early spring of 1206 AD, on the sacred grasslands at the source of the Onon River, leaders of various Mongol tribes gathered from all directions to attend a Kurultai, the highest traditional assembly used since ancient times on the steppes to decide major tribal affairs. At this momentous gathering, Temujin was unanimously acclaimed by all the assembled leaders as the supreme ruler of all Mongols and was solemnly bestowed with a noble title that would resound throughout the known world, Genghis Khan. As for the exact meaning of this epoch-making title, scholars from different fields continue to debate to this day. The moment the nine-tailed white banner was raised on the banks of the Onang River marked one of the most pivotal turning points in the entire course of human civilization, though no other civilization on the planet was aware of it at the time. Distant Europe was immersed in the religious fervor of the Crusades, with no attention to spare for the East. The once glorious Arab Empire was steadily draining its vitality through endless internal power struggles. Meanwhile, the Southern Song dynasty and the Jin regime in the East eyed each other warily across the Huai River, neither daring to make a move. No one in the world knew that on the distant Mongolian plateau. Throughout the entire narrative of Chapter 3, the ultimate showdown between Temujin and Jamukha over the years was never merely a personal feud between two heroes of the steppe. At its core, it was a life and death final test between two fundamentally different models of civilization. The closed hierarchical system that Jamukha staunchly defended ultimately lost to the open merit-based system advocated and implemented by Temujin. This historical outcome, seemingly confined to the Mongolian steppe, had profound and far-reaching ripple effects on the fate of the entire world thereafter. Imagine if Jamukha had emerged victorious back then. How can a person mercilessly abandoned by the world rewrite the rules of its operation through order and violence? Chapter 3 provides a crucial interim answer to this central question that runs throughout the film. The first step is to completely replace the outdated old order with a new one, to substitute privilege based on lineage with fairness that wins people's hearts, and to replace hereditary entitlement with merit-based capability. Temujin's unification of the Mongolian steppe was never achieved through mere slaughter and conquest. What he truly relied on was offering every willing follower a better choice that was impossible under the old system. At the Kurultai of 1206, Genghis Khan was granted an unprecedented title, yet he understood clearly that the title itself held no real significance. The steppe had never lacked men elected as Khans. What it lacked was wisdom capable of sustaining the Khanate beyond a single generation. Before him, every unification of the Mongolian steppe had ended in the same way. Upon the death of a strong leader, the alliance would immediately collapse, and the tribes would revert to governing themselves. Temujin was determined to break this vicious cycle. He aimed to establish not a loose alliance reliant on personal prestige, but a self-sustaining institutional system that could be passed down through generations. For the first time, he sought to bring law, military organization, and administrative structures to the steppe. There have been many conquerors, but few lawmakers. Genghis Khan's first and most fundamental institutional revolution was the establishment of the 1,000-household system. He disbanded and reorganized all the populations of the steppe, regardless of tribe, into a strict hierarchical structure. 10 people formed a squad, 100 formed 100 households, 1,000 formed 1,000 households, and 10,000 formed a 10,000 household unit. This was not merely a reform of military organization, but a complete overturning of the millennia-old social structure of the steppe. Previously, Mongol identity was entirely based on bloodline and tribe, who you were dependent on, which tribe you belonged to, and who your father was. The 1,000-household system uprooted all of this. From then on, your identity was determined by the 1,000-household unit you were part of, and your loyalty was no longer to tribal leaders, but to the state system. The social foundation that had endured for 1,000 years was rewritten with a single decree. The most revolutionary aspect of the 1,000-household system lay in the criteria for selecting the commanders of these units. Genghis Khan personally appointed 95 commanders, and the list of these individuals essentially served as a roster of the founding shareholders of the Mongol Empire. Among them were loyal old ministers who had followed Temujin since his youth, fierce generals who had earned their positions through valor on the battlefield, capable individuals who had defected from rival tribes, and even low-ranking warriors who had risen from the slave class. The only commonality was that they all attained their positions through personal ability and loyalty to Genghis Khan. Not a single one was chosen because of their father's name or tribal lineage. This was groundbreaking across the entire Eurasian continent at the time. In Europe, the brilliance of the thousand-household system lies not only in its military organization, but also in its role as an administrative and social governance framework. Each thousand-household unit served as both a combat formation and a production and administrative entity. In times of war, the thousand-household leader acted as a military commander, leading troops into battle, while in peacetime, they functioned as an administrative official, overseeing grazing, migration, taxation, and dispute resolution within their jurisdiction. This integration of military and administrative functions perfectly aligned with the nomadic way of life. On the steppes, it was impossible to separate soldiers from herders, as every herder was a soldier, and every soldier had to be a herder. The thousand-household system institutionalized this reality, enabling the entire Mongol. The thousand-household system also had a function often overlooked by later generations. It served as a powerful social melting pot. When Genghis Khan organized the thousand-household units, he deliberately mixed and dispersed different tribes. Yesterday's enemies on the battlefield, the Khian and Tatar people, were now required to live in the same camp, herd together, train together, and fight side by side. This forced integration was initially fraught with friction, but after a generation or two, the original tribal identities gradually gave way to the identity of the thousand-household unit. People no longer said, "I am a Tatar," but instead, "I belong to such and such thousand-household unit." This was Genghis Khan's greatest ingenuity. He did not eliminate the tribes, but allowed the concept of tribe to naturally fade away within the new system. He replaced kinship with organization and tradition with institutions, accomplishing this seamlessly and without fanfare. Above the thousand-household system, Genghis Khan established a more elite organization, the Keshik. Keshik means guard in Mongolian. But Genghis Khan's Keshik was far more than just a personal guard. It served as the heart of the empire, combining the triple functions of a military elite, an administrative center, and a talent cultivation hub. Genghis Khan required each thousand-household leader to send his most outstanding son to serve in the Keshik. These young men learned military command, administrative management, and diplomatic affairs by the Khan's side, while also acting as hostages to ensure the absolute loyalty of the thousand household leaders to the Khan. The Keshik numbered around 10,000 in total. During the day, they managed the empire's daily affairs, ranging from logistics and supply to messenger dispatch. And at night, they took turns guarding the Khan's tent. Another cornerstone of Genghis Khan's institutional revolution was the Great Yasa, the fundamental law of the Mongol Empire in Mongolian. Yasa means decree or command, and the Great Yasa was the compilation of all such decrees, serving as the constitution and penal code of the Mongol Empire. Unfortunately, the complete original text of the Great Yasa has been lost, and today we can only piece together its general content through scattered records by Persian and Arab historians. Yet, even from these surviving fragments, we can discern the revolutionary nature of the Great Yasa. It was the first written law on the steppes, transforming a social order that had previously relied entirely on customs and the personal will of leaders into a legal system with clear provisions, unified standards, and strict punitive mechanisms. The Great Yasa encompassed every aspect of Mongolian social life, from military discipline to commercial transactions, and from marriage and family to religious beliefs, among its most notable provisions were a strict prohibition on intertribal plundering. Previously, the most common and intractable scourge on the steppe. The stipulation that all Mongols, regardless of status, must obey the same set of laws. Even the Great Khan's relatives would face the same punishment for breaking the law. And the mandatory implementation of a messenger system and postal stations to ensure that imperial decrees could reach the most remote corners of the empire in the shortest possible time. While these laws may seem commonplace today, each was a groundbreaking innovation on the Mongolian steppe in the early 13th century. One of the most astonishing provisions in the Great Yasa for later generations was the regulation concerning religious beliefs. Genghis Khan explicitly declared that all religions within the Mongol Empire were equal, and no one should be persecuted or discriminated against due to differing beliefs. This was almost unimaginable in the world of the 13th century. During the same period, Europe was engaged in brutal crusades against heretics. Islamic regimes in the Middle East imposed additional taxes on Christians and Jews. And even the relatively tolerant Chinese dynasties frequently witnessed events of Buddhist suppression or religious exclusion. Yet, Genghis Khan, a leader from a nomadic people without a written tradition, implemented the most progressive religious policy of the entire civilized world at that time. Another key institutional innovation by Genghis Khan was the introduction and promotion of the Mongolian script. Before unifying the steppe, the Mongols had no writing system of their own, relying entirely on oral transmission for all decrees, treaties, and communications. While this was barely sufficient for managing a small tribal confederation, it was entirely inadequate for governing an increasingly vast empire. During the conquest of the Naiman tribe, Genghis Khan captured a Uyghur scribe named Tata Tonga, who was proficient in the Uyghur script. Genghis Khan ordered Tata Tonga to adapt the Uyghur alphabet to transcribe the Mongolian language, creating the official writing system of the Mongol Empire. He also mandated that his sons and the children of the nobility all learn to read and write. In addition to the 1,000 household system, the Great Yasa, and the writing system, Genghis Khan also established an astonishingly efficient communication and logistics network, the postal relay system, also known as the YAM. This was a rapid communication and transportation route spanning the entire Mongol Empire, with relay stations set up approximately every 30 to 50 kilometers, each equipped with ample horses, provisions, and personnel. Messengers rode swift horses from one station to the next, changing horses without changing riders, or changing riders without changing horses, allowing urgent military intelligence to travel hundreds of kilometers within 24 hours. This system enabled the imperial center to monitor events on the frontiers, almost in real time, a near miracle given the technological conditions of the time. In Genghis Khan's system design, there was another often overlooked, but extremely important principle: the merit-based distribution system. After each victorious war, the spoils were not divided arbitrarily by commanders at various levels, but were allocated uniformly by the Khan according to strict rules. Every soldier, regardless of their background, received a share based on their actual performance in battle. An ordinary soldier who performed great deeds could receive greater rewards than a mediocre commander of 1,000 households. This system completely eradicated the traditional practice of aristocratic monopoly over benefits on the steppe, making every Mongol soldier clearly understand that every bit of effort on the battlefield would be justly rewarded. This transparency. Genghis Khan also systematically developed diplomatic institutions. He established the sacred principle of the inviolability of envoys. Envoys from any country were guaranteed absolute safety within the Mongol Empire. And similarly, envoys of the Mongol Empire should not be harmed anywhere. This diplomatic rule was not a ceremonial gesture for Genghis Khan, but a matter of life and death, a fundamental bottom line. The reason why the later actions of the Khwarezmian Empire, which killed Mongol merchants and envoys, provoked Genghis Khan's most furious retaliation, lies precisely in this. It was not because a few people died, but because the entire trust system and international order upon which the empire operated were openly trampled. In Genghis Khan's logic, let's examine what Genghis Khan's institutional revolution meant from a broader perspective. Before him, the Mongolian steppe was a purely lawless jungle society where the strong preyed on the weak. There were no written laws, no administrative bodies, no unified system of weights and measures, and no written record-keeping system. The rise and fall of a tribe depended entirely on whether its leader was strong enough. If the leader was powerful, the tribe thrived. If the leader died, the tribe disbanded. Within just over a decade, Genghis Khan transformed this untamed land into a modern empire with a complete legal system, efficient administrative institutions, a unified military organization, a nationwide communication network, and an official writing system. The speed and efficiency of such institutional development are extremely rare in the entire history of humankind. Another core concept that ran through Genghis Khan's institutional revolution was the extreme emphasis on loyalty and its institutionalized guarantee. In his system, loyalty was not a moral expectation, but a clear institutional arrangement with defined rewards and punishments. The loyal were always richly rewarded. Borshu rose from being the son of a herdsman to become the highest-ranking commander of 10,000 in the empire. Betrayers were severely punished, even those who helped Genghis Khan capture his enemies, if they did so by betraying their former masters, were immediately executed. Recall the fate of the 5 companions who betrayed Jamukha when he was captured. With iron-fisted methods, Genghis Khan sent an unmistakable signal throughout the empire. In this, Genghis Khan's system was not entirely his own creation, but heavily drew from the experiences of surrounding civilizations. The prototype of the 1,000-household system can be traced back to precedents in the Turkic Uyghur Empire. The Uyghur script originated from Sogdian letters. The postal relay system had long-standing traditions in both China and Persia. And the policy of religious tolerance may have been influenced by advisors from various cultural spheres. Genghis Khan's genius lay not in inventing everything from scratch, but in his keen ability to discern which systems were useful, then integrating them into a unified framework, with remarkable execution, and adapting them to the needs of the steppe. He was an integrator and optimizer of institutions. The greatest innovations often do not involve inventing something entirely new, but rather combining existing elements in the most intelligent way. Genghis Khan's institutional reforms fundamentally transformed the combat methods and effectiveness of the Mongol army. Before the establishment of the 1,000-household system, warfare on the steppes was essentially chaotic conflicts among tribal alliances, with each tribe fighting independently, lacking unified command and coordination. If a battle turned unfavorable, a tribe might suddenly retreat or even switch sides, causing the entire allied force to collapse instantly. After the implementation of the 1,000-household system, the Mongol army became a disciplined, hierarchical, and precisely controlled war machine. Every squad leader knew they must obey the orders of the centurion. Every centurion knew they must obey the orders of the chiliarch, and every chiliarch knew they must obey the orders of the myriarch. The great Yasa explicitly stipulated that anyone who deserted on the battlefield would be executed, with their entire squad held accountable. However, we must not overly romanticize Genghis Khan's institutional reforms. The implementation of these systems was far from gentle. It was marked by bloodshed and coercion, the dismantling of tribes and reorganization into thousands of households meant countless families were forcibly separated from their clans, with whom they had lived for generations, and assigned to entirely unfamiliar groups. Old nobles who refused to comply were ruthlessly stripped of their power, or even physically eliminated. The harsh penalties of the Great Yasa ensured that any defiance came at a heavy price. Stealing a horse could be punishable by death, and failing to rescue a comrade on the battlefield was equally a capital offense. Genghis Khan's order was built on iron and blood. He brought unprecedented order and fairness to the steppe, but at the cost of unprecedented obedience and fear. Placing Genghis Khan's institutional revolution within the contemporary global context reveals an intriguing phenomenon. In early 13th century Europe, feudal fragmentation and the tug of war between ecclesiastical and royal powers persisted. With the Magna Carta in England not signed until 1215 and its enforceability extremely limited, the Southern Song dynasty in China, despite possessing the world's most advanced civil service system, was hampered by military weakness. The Islamic empires of Central Asia and the Middle East were mired in division and internal strife, unable to extricate themselves. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan, a leader from the steppes who hailed from a nomadic people without even a written language, established within just 2 decades a system of governance that surpassed all ancient civilizations of the time in efficiency and execution. Genghis Khan's institutional system possessed a crucial yet often overlooked feature: its scalability. The design of the 1,000-household system was inherently suited for outward expansion. Each newly conquered region could be seamlessly integrated by incorporating the local population into the existing 1,000-household framework. The legal provisions of the Great Yasa did not rely on any specific cultural tradition, allowing them to be universally applied across different civilizations. The postal relay system could extend indefinitely. As long as the empire's territory expanded, the courier routes followed. The policy of religious tolerance eliminated the greatest obstacle in conquering foreign civilizations. The conquered did not need to change their beliefs, significantly reducing their willingness to resist. In other words, Genghis Khan designed. Looking back at the core argument of Chapter 4, Genghis Khan's greatest legacy was not the amount of land he conquered, or the number of enemies he killed, but rather the establishment of an institutional system capable of functioning independently of individual will. The 1,000-household system addressed the issue of social organization. The Great Yasa resolved legal order. The writing system tackled information transmission and knowledge preservation. The postal network solved communication and logistical challenges. The Kashik handled talent cultivation and central management, and the policy of religious tolerance addressed the complexities of pluralistic governance. Individually, none of these institutions were earth-shattering, but when integrated into a unified framework and operated in synergy, they unleashed immense energy that changed the world. Why could that orphan who dug for wild vegetables on the steppe conceive such a sophisticated system? The answer may lie in his painful childhood. Temujin personally experienced the horror after the collapse of tribal order. Once his father died, the tribe immediately scattered like birds and beasts, and those who had pledged loyalty quickly turned into deserters and persecutors. This experience made him more eager than anyone to establish an order that would not collapse with the death of a single individual. The 1,000-household system was his institutionalized response to the lesson that tribal loyalty was unreliable, and the Great Yasa was his alternative to the law of the jungle. All the systems he established pointed to the same goal: to make order endure beyond individuals, and to let rules transcend power. A man abandoned by order devoted his entire life to creating a new one. How can an outcast of the world rewrite it? Chapter 4 provides the most crucial answer. He used systems to solidify violence into order, reorganize chaos into structure, and forge scattered sand into a torrent of steel. The 5 pillars, the 1,000-household system, the Great Yasa, the Keshik, the postal relay stations, and the written script, supported the most expansive contiguous land empire in history. But establishing the system was only the beginning. The true test lay in actual combat. In the next chapter, Genghis Khan would face the greatest opponent of his life. Not the steppe tribes, but the vast Khwarezmian Empire of Central Asia. The Sultan of Khwarezm would provoke this war machine in the most foolish way. And what awaited him would be the most terrifying military retaliation in the history of human civilization. The blade of the system was about to be unsheathed, and all of Central Asia remained oblivious. By the year 1218, the Mongol Empire was no longer just a regional power on the steppes. After unifying Mongolia, Genghis Khan had conquered the western Xia, forcing it into submission, and then launched a large-scale war against the Jin dynasty, capturing Zhongdu present-day Beijing. The fearsome reputation of the Mongol cavalry had already spread across the East Asian continent, but to the distant lands of Central Asia and the Western world, the Mongols remained a vague and unfamiliar name. In the court of the Khwarezmian Empire, almost no one took the threat from the eastern steppes seriously. Unbeknownst to them, a war machine, meticulously calibrated through the 1,000-household system and the Great Yasa, was slowly turning westward, and they themselves were about to press the button that would set it in motion. The Khwarezmian Empire was the most powerful Islamic state in Central Asia at the time, with its territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Aral Sea, encompassing vast areas of present-day Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Sultan Muhammad proclaimed himself the successor of Alexander the Great, ruling over millions of people and dozens of prosperous cities. Samarkand, Bukhara, and Herat were renowned as the most bustling commercial hubs along the Silk Road. The Khwarezmian Empire boasted an army said to number 400,000, and to Muhammad, the empire seemed impregnable. However, size did not equate to strength, and wealth did not guarantee resilience. Internally, the empire had long been corroded by power struggles, its dazzling exterior masking a fatal fragility. Genghis Khan initially had no intention of waging war against the Khwarezmian Empire. Instead, he proactively dispatched a large trade caravan to Khwarezm, consisting of 450 merchants carrying substantial amounts of gold, silver, silk, and precious goods. This caravan also served a diplomatic mission to gauge the attitude of Khwarezm and establish commercial relations between the two nations. Genghis Khan was a deeply pragmatic man, aware that the profits from trade were far more sustainable and stable than those gained through plunder in war. In his official letter to Muhammad II, he even used extremely humble language, addressing the latter as the ruler of the West, while referring to himself as the ruler of the East, expressing his sincere desire for mutual benefit through trade. This was not a sign of weakness, but a rational choice made by a mature imperial ruler. The disaster occurred in Otrar, a border city in the eastern part of Khwarezm. When the Mongol trade caravan arrived in the city, the local governor Inalchuk made a decision that would alter the fate of Central Asia. He detained all members of the caravan on charges of espionage, confiscated all goods, and then executed all 450 merchants. The motives behind this decision remain debated to this day. Perhaps it was greed for the immense wealth carried by the caravan. Perhaps it was arrogant contempt for the Mongols. Or perhaps it was simply the habitual brutality and short-sightedness of a frontier warlord. But, whatever the reason, 450 lives and mountains of goods vanished within the walls of Otrar. This was not a mere border dispute, but a diplomatic catastrophe. Genghis Khan did not immediately go to war. He did something no Mongol leader of the time would have done. He sent a formal diplomatic mission to the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, demanding that the Sultan hand over the murderers and compensate for the losses. This was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of the spirit of the Great Yasa, the inviolability of envoys, and the respect for diplomatic protocol. He gave Muhammad II a chance to resolve the matter honorably. However, Muhammad's response exceeded everyone's expectations. He rejected the Mongols' demands, killed the chief envoy, shaved the beards of the 2 deputy envoys, and sent them back in Islamic culture. Shaving a man's beard is the ultimate insult, and killing an envoy is a blatant violation of international norms. Muhammad believed he was demonstrating strength, unaware that he had just signed the empire's death warrant. The humiliated deputy envoy returned to Mongolia with a face full of scars and shame. After hearing the report, Genghis Khan ascended Mount Burkhan alone, the very mountain where he had once hidden to escape the pursuit of the Merkits. He remained on the mountain for 3 days and 3 nights without food or drink, silently swearing an oath to the eternal blue sky. When he descended, those around him saw something unprecedented in his eyes. Not anger, but a cold determination that went beyond rage. He said to his generals, "In essence, I did not start this war. They chose war. Now I will make every city in Khwarezm remember a lesson. The envoys and merchants of the Mongol Empire are not livestock, to be slaughtered at will." In the autumn of 1219, Genghis Khan personally led a great army on a western expedition. The size of this force varies across historical records, but the most reliable estimate places it between 100,000 and 150,000 troops. This number was far smaller than the Khwarezmian Empire's claimed army of 400,000. However, numerical superiority was never the Mongols' strength. Their advantage lay in the absolute discipline, mobility, and coordinated combat capabilities forged by the 1,000 household system. Each Mongol cavalryman carried at least 3 war horses, enabling them to march continuously for days without rest, and every soldier brought their own provisions, eliminating the need for a massive logistical convoy. The entire army could advance like a pack of wolves, dispersing and then suddenly converging at designated times and locations. Genghis Khan's Western expedition strategy demonstrated breathtaking military genius. He divided his forces into 4 routes. His eldest son Jochi and second son Chagatai led troops to besiege Otrar, the source of the crime where the merchant caravan was massacred. His third son Feidiai attacked the southern Fenakit to cut off the Khwarezmian flank. Genghis Khan himself led the main force straight to Bukhara, the cultural and religious center of the empire. The most brilliant move was sending the General Jeb to lead elite cavalry around the Tian Shan mountains, suddenly appearing from a direction the Khwarezmians believed impossible. Striking from the rear, like 4 sharp blades, the 4 armies simultaneously pierced deep into the heart of Khwarezm, leaving Muhammad II utterly unable to determine the main direction of attack. This was a textbook-level strategic encirclement. The siege of Otrar was the most symbolic battle of this war. Jochi and Chagatai led their troops to tightly surround the city that had massacred the Mongol merchant caravan. The city was defended by Inochak, the governor who had ordered the slaughter of the merchants, knowing that surrender would bring no mercy. He resisted desperately. The siege lasted 5 months, during which the city exhausted its food and water supplies, and the defenders fell in waves. Eventually, the Mongol army breached the walls and engaged in brutal street-by-street, alley-by-alley urban warfare. Inochak retreated to the inner city, and it is said that when he ran out of ammunition and supplies, he stood on the city tower and hurled bricks at the Mongol soldiers until he was captured alive. Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into his eyes and ears, a punishment for having seen the wealth of his merchants and heard their pleas for mercy, yet choosing slaughter. The fall of Bukhara was equally shocking when Genghis Khan led his main forces to suddenly appear beneath the city walls. Both the defenders and the residents were stunned. How could the Mongols come from that direction? A portion of the defenders attempted to break through the siege but were intercepted and slaughtered by Mongol cavalry outside the city, leaving the remaining defenders and residents with no choice but to open the gates and surrender. Genghis Khan rode into one of the most sacred cities of the Islamic world and went directly to the largest mosque. According to Persian historical records, he asked if this was the Sultan's palace. Upon being told it was the house of God, he ascended the pulpit and addressed the residents, saying, "Your Sultan has committed grave sins, so heaven has sent me to punish you," regardless of whether the details were embellished by later generations. The core message is clear. Genghis Khan was endowing his conquest with the legitimacy of divine mandate. Samarkand was the capital of the Khwarezmian Empire, and the largest and wealthiest city in Central Asia at the time, boasting a population of several 100,000 and formidable fortifications. Muhammad II gathered his most elite troops here, preparing for a final stand. However, when the Mongol army appeared outside the city walls, Muhammad made an unbelievable decision. He abandoned his capital, his army, and his people, fleeing overnight. This decision proved even more fatal than the governor of Otrar's massacre of the merchant caravan, as it fundamentally shattered the Khwarezmian army's will to resist. If the Sultan had fled, who would still be willing to die for the empire? After a few days of resistance, Samarkand opened its gates and surrendered. Genghis Khan did not stop after capturing Samarkand. He dispatched Jabe and Subutai with 20,000 elite cavalry to hunt down the fleeing Muhammad II. This was no ordinary pursuit, but a clear death sentence. Genghis Khan aimed to show the world that those who killed Mongol envoys could never escape punishment, no matter how far they fled. Relentlessly pursued, Muhammad fled westward across the entire Persian plateau, moving from city to city, only to find the Mongol cavalry appearing like ghosts behind him at every turn. In the end, he took refuge on a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died miserably from fear, illness, and despair. A ruler who had compared himself to Alexander the Great met his final rest in an unmarked grave on a desolate island. After the death of Muhammad, his son Jalal ad-Din attempted to turn the tide by organizing the remaining forces to resist. Jalal ad-Din was entirely different from his father, brave, resilient, and gifted in military strategy. In the Battle of Parwan, he managed to defeat a Mongol army, achieving the only victory in the resistance of the Khwarezmian Empire. Genghis Khan took this seriously and personally led his main forces to confront this young adversary. Eventually, Jalal ad-Din was cornered by the Mongol army on the banks of the Indus River, facing a desperate situation. He made a legendary choice. Riding his horse, he leaped off the cliff into the turbulent river, miraculously swam to the opposite shore, and escaped into India. Genghis Khan stood on the cliff, watching him disappear into the distance, and reportedly told his generals, "A father should have a son like this." This was a rare tribute from a conqueror to a brave warrior. The Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not merely a military triumph, but a systematic annihilation. One after another, the great cities of Central Asia were reduced to ruins under the Mongol onslaught. Bukhara was burned, Samarkand was sacked, Nishapur was razed to the ground, and the majority of Herat's inhabitants were massacred. Before their conquest, these cities had been among the most prosperous in the civilized world, boasting centuries of cultural heritage, exquisite architecture, libraries, and irrigation systems. The Mongol conquest swept away these achievements entirely. Estimates of the death toll vary widely across historical sources, ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions. Modern scholars generally agree that Persian accounts significantly exaggerate the numbers. But even with a more conservative estimate, the loss of life and destruction of civilization caused by this conquest remains staggering. But we must pause here to ask an important question. Were the Mongols' large-scale massacres uncontrolled acts of barbaric violence, or were they planned and purposeful military strategies? The answer is likely the latter. Genghis Khan's massacres followed a clear pattern. Cities that surrendered without resistance were typically treated with relative leniency, with their inhabitants integrated into the imperial system to continue their lives. Cities that resisted and were subsequently captured faced severe retaliation, with the intensity of the punishment increasing with the fierceness of the resistance. And cities that rebelled after surrendering were completely destroyed, leaving no survivors. Although brutal, this logic was remarkably clear. By instilling extreme fear, the Mongols aimed to reduce the cost of resistance in future conquests. The speed of the Mongol conquest in Central Asia was astonishing. From their departure in the autumn of 1219 to the spring of 1221, it took less than 2 years for the entire Khwarezmian Empire to fall. An empire spanning thousands of kilometers, with an army of 400,000 and a population of tens of millions, crumbled before a Mongol cavalry force of just over 100,000. The reasons were multifaceted. The mobility and execution capabilities of the Mongol army far surpassed the cumbersome infantry and cavalry of the Khwarezmian forces. The 1,000-household system ensured seamless command transmission. Internal ethnic conflicts and power struggles within the Khwarezmian Empire severely weakened its resistance, and the flight of Muhammad II further shattered the empire's will to resist from a psychological standpoint. An empire, rotting from within, could not even put up a decent struggle when faced with an external, overwhelming force. During their conquests, the Mongol armies demonstrated a side that went beyond mere slaughter. Genghis Khan ordered the protection of artisans, scholars, doctors, and religious figures. Individuals with specialized skills were selected from the ruins and sent to serve in the empire's rear. The finest architects from Central Asia were taken to design palaces, the most skilled blacksmiths to forge weapons, and the most learned scholars to serve as advisors and translators. Genghis Khan valued talent even more than gold and silver. In his view, the loss of a skilled artisan was greater than that of plundered gold. This systematic protection and utilization of specialized talent was one of the key factors that enabled the Mongol Empire to rapidly evolve from a steppe nomadic regime into a cross-civilizational empire. He plundered not only wealth, but also wisdom. The fall of Khwarezmia sent shockwaves of immense fear throughout the Islamic world, and even further west. Before this, for civilizations west of Central Asia, the Mongols were merely a distant, legendary tribe of barbarians from the eastern steppes. Now, they had suddenly become a terrifying reality. Persian historians recorded this catastrophe with apocalyptic descriptions, with some writing that humanity had never suffered such a dreadful disaster since the creation of Adam. Tales of Mongol terror spread across the Arab world, from Spain to Baghdad. The Christian realms of Europe also began to receive ominous news from the East. The civilized order of the entire Old World felt a chilling breath from the steppes. Examining the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire from a deeper perspective reveals a recurring pattern. Khwarezm did not perish due to a lack of military strength. Its forces were at least 3 to 4 times larger than those of the Mongols. It fell because of systemic failure. The empire of Muhammad II lacked an effective command structure to coordinate its armies, which were scattered across vast territories. Cities operated without a unified defense strategy, fighting independently without mutual support. Distrust between the Sultan and local governors was so profound that a single blow shattered their fragile trust. In contrast, the Mongol decimal system ensured efficient transmission of orders, the Yasa enforced absolute discipline, and the postal relay system allowed Genghis Khan to deploy troops in real time across thousands of kilometers of battlefront. The fall of Khwarezm was, in essence, the defeat of an outdated system by a more advanced one. However, we must honestly confront an unavoidable moral issue. Regardless of how advanced the Mongolian system was, or how sophisticated their military strategies. The large-scale massacres during the conquest of Khwarezm remain one of the darkest chapters in the history of human civilization. Hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions, of innocent civilians lost their lives. The irrigation systems that had flourished for centuries were destroyed, turning oases into deserts that have yet to fully recover to this day. The cultural and academic traditions of Central Asia suffered devastating blows, failing to regain their former glory for centuries. Thereafter, Genghis Khan was a genius in institutional design. Yet, he was also the mastermind and executor of the largest-scale destruction. These two facts coexist within one individual and cannot be easily reconciled. Greatness and terror reached equally extreme heights in him. Around 1223 AD, Genghis Khan's military campaigns in Central Asia had largely concluded. He left behind a portion of his forces to continue suppressing remaining resistance while he led the main army back east. During the long journey home, he passed through the ruins of cities destroyed by his own troops, witnessing once bustling streets overgrown with weeds. It is said that, along the way, he summoned the renowned Taoist master, Chu Chuji, also known as Changchun Zhenren, seeking advice from this Chinese sage on the secrets of immortality and the principles of governance. Chu Chuji did not provide him with a formula for eternal life, but instead cautioned him to reduce bloodshed and practice benevolent rule. Whether Genghis Khan heeded these words remains unknown, but in his later years, he did exhibit greater restraint in certain aspects. The Khwarezmian War had profound effects on the Mongol Empire itself. For the first time, the Mongols systematically encountered a highly developed urban civilization, sophisticated irrigation projects, grand architecture, complex commercial networks, and advanced handicraft technologies. A large number of artisans, scholars, merchants, and administrative talents from the conquered regions were brought into the empire, significantly enhancing its technological and managerial capabilities. The development of siege engine technology, improvements in gunpowder weapons, the opening of long-distance trade routes, and cross-cultural knowledge exchange. All of these began with the Khwarezmian War. While destroying civilizations, the conquerors were themselves transformed by them. Following this, the Mongol Empire embarked on a long process of transitioning from a nomadic regime to a transcontinental empire. Violence opened the door, and civilization walked in. How does a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? Chapter 5 presents the most extreme aspect. When order is scorned and trampled, violence is unleashed in its most terrifying form, crushing all obstacles. The Sultan of Khwarezm's killing of Mongol merchants and envoys not only insulted Genghis Khan but also challenged the system of rules he had spent his life establishing. Genghis Khan made the entire Central Asian civilization pay an unbearable price for this. Yet, it was precisely this disproportionate retaliation that established the Pax Mongolica for nearly a century to come. Within the Mongol sphere of influence, no one dared to harm merchants or envoys again. Terror became the foundation of peace, and violence the guardian of order. In the next chapter, Jabe and Supputai are about to carve a blood-red arc across Eurasia. The smoke had yet to clear over the ruins of Khwarezm, when the two sharpest blades of the Mongol Empire were already unsheathed. Jabe and Supputai, the two most brilliant tactical geniuses under Genghis Khan, were ordered to lead 20,000 elite cavalry westward in pursuit of the remnants of Khwarezm. Yet the mission of this force extended far beyond chasing down fugitives. Genghis Khan had given them a secret command to detour through the Persian Plateau and the Caucasus Mountains to conduct a large-scale strategic reconnaissance of the unknown world west of the empire. This was no ordinary expedition, but one of the boldest and most audacious long-range raids in the history of human warfare. 20,000 cavalry were about to carve an astonishing arc across the southern expanse of Eurasia. Their hooves would tread lands no Mongol had ever set foot on, and their blades would etch the terror from the eastern steppes into the memory of peoples who had never even heard the name Mongol. The expedition route of Jab and Sabbatai reads like an incredible adventure novel. They first traversed northern Persia, crushing all local forces that attempted to block their path along the way. Then, they crossed the treacherous and supposedly impassable mountain passes of the Caucasus, entering the territories of Georgia and Armenia. The king of Georgia dispatched his most elite knightly legions to intercept this mysterious eastern army of unknown origin, only to be completely annihilated by the Mongol cavalry, using their classic tactic of luring the enemy deep into their trap. The Mongols continued northward into the southern Russian steppes, which are present day Ukraine and southern Russia. In these vast grasslands, they encountered another powerful nomadic people, the Kipchaks. Unable to resist alone, the Kipchaks sent an urgent plea for help to their Slavic neighbors, the princes of the Rus' principalities. In May 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River, a battle that would determine the fate of Eastern Europe began. The Rus principalities assembled a coalition army, led by multiple princes, with an estimated total force ranging from 40,000 to 80,000 men, combined with the cavalry of the Cumans. The allied forces vastly outnumbered the 20,000 Mongol horsemen. However, the Rus coalition made a fatal mistake. Mutual suspicion among the princes led to a lack of unified command. The Grand Prince of Kiev refused to heed the advice of the Prince of Galicia, who in turn was unwilling to wait for the full assembly of the other prince's troops and charged ahead first. The Mongols skillfully exploited this chaos. Sabbatai first feigned retreat with a small force to lure the overeager Rus vanguard into pursuit. Once the pursuers were separated from the main force, the Mongols suddenly reversed their retreat, encircled and annihilated them, then turned to launch a fierce assault on the already disorganized Rus main army. After the Battle of the Kalka River, the Mongols did something that sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world to the captured Rus princes. They bound the captive princes and laid them on the ground, covering them with a massive wooden plank, upon which the Mongol commanders then sat to hold their victory feast. The princes were crushed and suffocated to death amidst the revelry of the Mongols. This method of execution had its own cultural logic for the Mongols. Not shedding the blood of nobles was a sign of respect for their status, as the Mongols believed noble blood should not touch the ground, but for the Christian world, it was seen as sheer barbaric terror. The news spread to every court and church across Europe, forever linking the name of the Mongols with the fear of the apocalypse. The significance of Jab and Sabbutai's expedition in military history cannot be overstated. Over the course of more than 2 years, 20,000 cavalrymen traversed over 8,000 kilometers across deserts, mountains, grasslands, and rivers, defeating every army they encountered, including Persian warlords, Georgian knights, Kipchak nomads, and the allied forces of Rus before safely returning to Mongol territory without losing their main force. Throughout the entire journey, they operated without supply lines, reinforcements, or a secure rear base, relying entirely on foraging and sustaining themselves through combat. This capability for long-range, independent operations was unparalleled in the world at the time. Even by today's standards of mechanized forces and satellite communications, the scale and achievements of this expedition remain awe-inspiring. It demonstrated that the Mongol army, forged by the 1,000-household system, had reached the absolute pinnacle of military effectiveness in the era of cold weapons. While Jab and Sabbatai were undertaking their legendary expedition, Genghis Khan himself was waging another significant war in the east, the final reckoning with the Western Xia and Jin dynasties. The Western Xia had refused to send troops in support during Genghis Khan's Western campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, an act of treachery he regarded as an unforgivable betrayal. In 1226, Genghis Khan assembled a massive army and launched a devastating offensive against the Western Xia once more. The outcome of this war was never in doubt. The Mongol forces, tempered by the Khwarezmian campaign, had far surpassed the military capabilities of the Western Xia in both technology and tactics. One by one, the cities of the Western Xia fell, their irrigation systems were destroyed, and their populations were subjected to large-scale massacres. Yet, just as this conquest was nearing its end, fate arranged an unexpected conclusion for the conqueror himself. In August 1227, Genghis Khan passed away during his campaign against the Western Xia. The cause of his death remains a subject of debate. Some say he suffered internal injuries from a fall off his horse. Others claim he succumbed to illness. While Persian historical records even suggest a dramatic tale of assassination by a Western Xia princess. Though the truth may never be fully uncovered, one thing is certain. By the time he closed his eyes, the empire he had founded had become one of the most expansive realms on earth. Stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the Persian plateau, and from the Siberian tundra to the North China plain, the Mongol Empire spanned the entire northern half of the Asian continent. Born 65 years earlier in a felt tent by the Onon River, clutching a clot of blood in his hand. This man spent his life uniting the most formidable cavalry forces across the vast untamed lands into an empire that would become one of the most awe-inspiring and fearsome in human history. On his deathbed, Genghis Khan made the most crucial arrangement for the succession of imperial power. He designated his third son, Feigeyi, as his heir. This choice itself was deeply significant. His eldest son, Jochi, was unsuitable for succession, due to controversies over his lineage. His second son, Chagatai, had a volatile temperament and lacked a talent for governance. And his youngest son, Tolui, though the most outstanding in military prowess, was, according to Mongol tradition, meant to inherit the family estate and guard the homeland rather than serve as an imperial ruler. Feigeyi, known for his generosity and skill in coordinating relationships among various factions, was the choice least likely to cause internal division. However, Genghis Khan might have already sensed the impending crisis. The rifts among his four sons were becoming increasingly evident, especially the nearly irreconcilable hatred between Jochi and Chagatai. With his will, he temporarily suppressed the seeds of division. But these seeds were destined to sprout eventually. From this moment onward, the fate of the empire's unity was overshadowed by the foreshadowing of its eventual fragmentation. The secretive handling of Genghis Khan's remains after his death is itself a legend. His body was transported back to the Mongolian steppe for a clandestine burial, and it is said that all living beings encountered along the way were killed to ensure the tomb's location would remain forever unknown to outsiders. Hundreds of horses were then repeatedly run over the burial site to trample the ground flat, blending the grave seamlessly with the surrounding grassland. A small tree was planted atop the tomb as a marker, but as the tree grew, the burial site vanished completely into the vast steppe, never to be found again. To this day, the exact burial place of Genghis Khan remains one of the greatest archaeological mysteries in the world. Countless explorers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters have spent centuries searching, all to no avail. The steppe has guarded the final secret of its greatest and most fearsome son. Upon ascending to the throne, Feigeyi continued his father's legacy of expansion. His first major achievement was the final conquest of the Jin dynasty. The Jin, a powerful regime that had once forced Genghis Khan's ancestors into submission for generations, was ultimately destroyed in 1234 after more than 2 decades of relentless attacks by the Mongol army. The last emperor of Jin committed suicide after the city of Kaizhou fell to the combined forces of the Mongols and the southern Song. This marked the Mongol Empire's complete dismantling of the old order in East Asia, and the fulfillment of Genghis Khan's greatest unfinished ambition. The fall of the Jin dynasty not only reshaped the political landscape of East Asia, but also provided the Mongol Empire with a wealth of administrative talent, technological resources, and governance experience from the Central Plains civilization. However, Fagedi's ambitions extended far beyond this. His gaze had already crossed the Caucasus Mountains, turning toward the distant west. In the year 1235, at the Kurultai Assembly, Fagedi made a decision that would shock the world to launch a large-scale expedition against Europe. He appointed Batu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, as the supreme commander of the Western campaign, with Subutai as the actual military commander. They gathered elite forces from various Mongol royal clans, totaling approximately 150,000 troops, and set out westward. This was the formal escalation of the reconnaissance expedition led by Jeb and Subutai 13 years earlier. What had once been a scouting mission of 20,000 cavalrymen had now transformed into a full-scale conquest with an army of 150,000. Subutai was already intimately familiar with the terrain, climate, and military strength of Europe, knowing full well that the divided and internally conflicted European kingdoms were no match for the Mongol cavalry. Meanwhile, the kings of Europe were almost entirely unprepared for the impending disaster. They still regarded the Mongols as distant, barbaric tribes from the east, unworthy of serious consideration. The Mongol Western expedition first swept through the Volga River basin, annihilating the Bulgar Khanate and the remnants of the Kipchaks, before splitting into two forces and advancing deep into the heart of the Rus principalities. Ryazan was the first city to be struck. After the Grand Duke refused to surrender, he organized a brave but hopeless sortie. The knights were no match for the Mongols. In terms of numbers and tactics, Ryazan fell after 6 days of resistance, and the entire city was looted and burned. Next, Vladimir, Moscow, Suzdal, and Tver fell one after another, with each city suffering a nearly identical fate: refusal to surrender, siege, capture, and brutal retaliation. The Mongols' combat capabilities in the snowy wilderness far exceeded the expectations of the Rus. They had believed the Russian winter would halt the invaders, unaware that the Mongols were even more adapted to the harsh cold. The land of Rus was plunged into catastrophe that winter. After conquering Rus, the Mongol army continued westward into the heart of Europe. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol forces launched simultaneous lightning attacks on Poland and Hungary, one led by Baydar heading north into Poland to divert the attention of the Nordic knights, while the main force commanded by Batu and Subutai moved south to capture Hungary, the wealthiest kingdom on the Danube plain. On the 9th of April, in the Battle of Legnica in Poland, Baydar employed brilliant tactics to annihilate the European coalition, led by Duke Henry II of Poland. Henry was beheaded, and his head was displayed on a spear for the army to see. On the same day, hundreds of kilometers away by the Tisza River in Hungary, Batu and Subutai were preparing an even larger-scale battle of annihilation. The Mongols achieved decisive victories on two battlefields hundreds of kilometers apart on the same day. A level of precise coordination across theaters unprecedented in medieval warfare. The Battle of the Tisza River, also known as the Battle of Moshi, was a decisive engagement in the Mongol invasion of Europe. King Bifela IV of Hungary assembled all the forces he could muster, estimated between 60,000 and 80,000 troops, and encamped on the Mohi plain by the Tisza River to await the Mongols. Subutai, a seasoned commander over 60 years old, yet still sharp-minded, devised a perfect plan for annihilation. Under cover of night, he dispatched a portion of his army to cross the Tisza River and seize a bridgehead on the opposite bank. while the main force quietly maneuvered downstream to flank the Hungarian camp from the rear. At dawn, the Mongols launched a sudden assault from 3 sides, deliberately leaving what appeared to be a gap in their encirclement. In panic, the Hungarian forces identified this as their only escape route and surged toward the opening, precisely the death trap Subutai had intended. After the Battle of Mohe, all of Europe trembled under the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. The Mongol army had advanced to the banks of the Danube, with Vienna within close reach. Pope Gregory IX issued a desperate appeal, calling on all Christian nations of Europe to unite against the pagan invaders from the east. Yet, the princes and kings remained mired in mutual suspicion and evasion, with none willing to be the first to confront the Mongol horsemen. However, just as European civilization seemed on the brink of annihilation, fate suddenly shifted. In late 1241, news reached the Western expeditionary forces that Genghis Khan had died in Mongolia. According to Mongol tradition, all members of the royal family had to return to Mongolia to participate in the election of the new Great Khan. Batu Khan ordered a full retreat, and the Mongol cavalry withdrew from Eastern Europe like a receding tide, returning to the Volga River region. The historical impact of the Mongol invasions on Europe was profound and enduring, a fact that remained unchanged even after the Mongols eventually withdrew. It completely ended the independence of the Rus' principalities. For over 2 centuries thereafter, the Rus were under the rule or vassalage of the Mongol Golden Horde. This period, referred to by Russian historians as the Tatar yoke, profoundly shaped Russian political culture, centralized authority, absolute obedience to power, and an unwavering pursuit of vast territories, all of which later became core characteristics of the empire, can be traced back to the era of Mongol rule. Secondly, the Mongol invasion delivered a massive psychological shock to Europe. Previously, Europeans lived within a closed worldview, centered on Christendom, and the Mongols were the first to make them aware of a completely different and powerful force from the east. This shock indirectly spurred external exploration, ultimately paving the way for the Age of Discovery. Looking back at the overall picture of Chapter 6, it becomes clear that the military conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors completely reshaped the political landscape of the entire Eurasian continent in less than 30 years. From the Pacific Ocean to the Danube, and from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, an unprecedented super-empire stretched across the Old World. This empire covered an area of over 30 million square kilometers, making it the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Within its borders lived dozens of ethnic groups, practicing 5 or 6 major religions and speaking hundreds of languages. The fact that such an unimaginably vast empire originated from an orphan abandoned by his tribe on the Mongolian steppe more than half a century earlier stands as the ultimate challenge to the imagination of human history. However, the speed of conquest also sowed the seeds of division. Genghis Khan's 4 sons each inherited a portion of the empire. The descendants of Jochi ruled the western steppes and established the Golden Horde. The descendants of Chagatai controlled Central Asia and founded the Chagatai Khanate. The descendants of Fagidi succeeded to the position of Great Khan and the core regions of the empire, while the descendants of Tului held the Mongol homeland and the most elite military forces. These 4 major khanates nominally submitted to the supreme authority of the Great Khan, but in reality, each had its own independent interests and ambitions. When a strong Great Khan was in power, the empire could maintain a semblance of unity. But once the succession to the Great Khan's throne was contested, conflicts among the khanates would rapidly intensify. The empire that Genghis Khan built over his lifetime began to develop irreparable cracks less than half a century after his death. How does a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? By the end of Chapter 6, the answer is fully revealed across the Eurasian landscape. born in a felt tent by the Onon River, clutching a blood clot in his hand. This infant would, in his 65 years of life, establish the largest empire in human history. His generals led iron-hoofed cavalry to every land from the Pacific to the Danube. The 1,000-household system and the great Yasa he created enabled a nomadic people, without a written language, to build a system surpassing that of ancient civilizations within a single generation. Yet, violence left scars that could never heal. Millions of lives lost, prosperous cities destroyed, and civilizations fractured. The next chapter will examine another, more enduring and complex legacy of Genghis Khan. The Pax Mongolica, the revitalized Silk Road, and an unprecedented exchange of civilizations between East and West. The end of war marks precisely the beginning of a new civilization. As the Mongol Empire's wars of conquest finally slowed, an unexpected phenomenon quietly emerged: peace. This was not the result of philosophers' sermons, nor the achievement of saints' prayers, but the silence that naturally descended after violence had crushed all resistance. From the Pacific coast to the Eastern European steppes, from the Siberian tundra to the Persian plateau, within the unimaginably vast territory of the Mongol Empire, an unprecedented tranquility was taking shape. Historians later gave this era a meaningful name: the Pax Mongolica. The term is deeply ironic. Peace was forged by the largest-scale war of conquest in human history. The swords that once sacked cities cooled and became signposts along trade routes, while the blood-soaked grasslands sprouted green grass beside the post roads. As violence completed its mission, order began to take over everything. Under the shelter of this order, an ancient trade route that had lain dormant for centuries was about to be revitalized: the Silk Road. The Silk Road was not an invention of the Mongols. This trade route connecting Eastern and Western civilizations had already been established during the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. However, for centuries before the rise of the Mongol Empire, the Silk Road had been nearly paralyzed due to endless wars and political upheavals in Central Asia. A merchant caravan departing from China had to traverse more than a dozen hostile kingdoms and tribal territories, paying tariffs at every border crossing and facing the risk of robbery in each new territory. A single journey could take years, with the majority of profits being consumed by extortion and losses along the way. Although the conquests of the Mongol Empire brought immense destruction, they also achieved something unprecedented: unifying the entire trade route from the Pacific to the Mediterranean under a single political authority and legal order. A merchant only needed to carry a pass issued by the Mongol Empire to travel from Beijing to the shores of the Black Sea without crossing a single national border. The Mongol Empire provided not only political unification for the Silk Road, but also a comprehensive infrastructure and institutional support system. The postal station system was the most critical component. A network spanning the entire empire that served not only military communications, but also offered merchants, lodging, supplies, and horse replacements. The Great Yasa Legal Code explicitly included provisions for the protection of merchants, stipulating severe legal penalties for anyone who plundered trade caravans. The Mongol Empire also standardized systems of weights and measures and taxation standards, significantly reducing the costs of cross-regional trade. More importantly, the empire implemented a system known as the Ortok state, funded, licensed commercial organizations. These Ortok merchants enjoyed official protection and financial support from the empire, and in return, they transported goods, relayed intelligence, and paid commercial taxes for the empire. Commerce was no longer an individual venture, but an integral part of the state governance system. Under the protection of Mongol peace, the variety of goods circulating along the Silk Road and the scale of trade reached unprecedented levels. From the east came not only silk and tea but also porcelain, lacquerware, gunpowder formulas, compass technology, printing achievements, as well as knowledge of Chinese medicine and mathematics. From the west and Central Asia to the east flowed Persian carpets and glassware, Arabian spices and astronomical knowledge, European gold and silver crafts and textile techniques, and even winemaking technology and new crop varieties. This was not merely the exchange of goods, but a large-scale, bidirectional flow of knowledge, technology, and ideas. Never before in human history had there been such extensive and systematic cross-civilizational exchange. Technologies and knowledge that had developed independently for thousands of years within isolated cultural spheres suddenly began to collide and merge along an unobstructed trade route, giving rise to entirely new possibilities. Unintentionally, the Mongol Empire created the first truly globalized era in human history. One of the most striking examples of cross-civilizational exchange during the Pax Mongolica was the westward transmission of gunpowder technology. Gunpowder was first invented in China and saw practical application in warfare during the conflicts between the Song and Jin dynasties. During their conquest of northern China, the Mongols captured a significant number of gunpowder weapons and artisans skilled in its production. These artisans were subsequently dispatched to various fronts of the Mongol Empire, spreading gunpowder technology to Central and West Asia. The earliest recorded mentions of gunpowder in the Arab world and Europe emerged in the mid-13th century, a timeline that closely aligns with the Mongol westward campaigns. While the precise pathways of gunpowder's transmission remain a subject of scholarly debate, there is broad consensus among historians that the Mongol Empire played a pivotal role as a conduit. The transfer of gunpowder from China to Europe revolutionized warfare, giving rise to firearms and cannons, ultimately bringing an end to the age of knights and catalyzing military and political transformations in Europe. Violence transmitted the technology, and the technology, in turn, forever altered the very nature of violence itself. Equally significant as gunpowder, if not more far-reaching in impact, was the westward transmission of printing and papermaking techniques. China's movable type printing technology and high-quality papermaking craftsmanship spread to Central Asia and Persia through the channels of the Mongol Empire. The historical compilation, Jami al-Tawarik, edited by the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, was completed using these advanced printing and papermaking techniques under the patronage of the Mongol Ilkhanate. This encyclopedic masterpiece records the histories of various peoples, from the Mongols and Chinese to the Arabs and Europeans, representing the first truly global historical work in human history. Printing technology continued its westward journey and was eventually refined into the metal movable type printing press by Germany's Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, sparking Europe's intellectual revolution and the Reformation. Along the lengthy chain of technological transmission from China's Baishan to Germany's Gutenberg, the Mongol Empire served as the most crucial intermediary link without the pathways opened by the Pax Mongolica. This journey might have been delayed for several more centuries. During the era of Mongol peace, cultural exchange was by no means limited to the material and technological spheres. The cross-civilizational spread of religion and thought also reached an unprecedented scale and depth. The Mongol Empire's policy of religious tolerance, a fundamental state policy established by Genghis Khan himself and inscribed in the Great Yasa, created a unique environment for dialogue and exchange among different faiths. In the courts and cities of the Mongol Empire, one could simultaneously witness Buddhist monks, Christian missionaries, Islamic scholars, Taoist practitioners, and shamanist priests, each preaching and debating with one another. The famous Great Debate of 1254 at the court of Mfei Khan serves as a classic example of this pluralistic religious coexistence. Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims openly debated the merits of their respective beliefs before the great Khan, who listened with keen interest, acting as a referee. Such a scene was unimaginable anywhere else in the world. At that time in Europe, religious heretics were burned at the stake, while in certain Islamic regimes, apostasy could similarly lead to execution. Marco Polo's journey to the East stands as the most famous and symbolic tale of cross-cultural exchange during the Pax Mongolica. The son of a Venetian merchant set out along the Silk Road in 1271, eventually spending 17 years at the court of Kublai Khan in the Yuan dynasty. His travelogue, regardless of its exaggerations and fabrications, provided Europeans with their first detailed glimpse of the splendid civilizations of the East. Chinese cities dwarfed any European capital in scale. The paper currency system astonished those accustomed to gold and silver transactions. The efficiency of the postal relay network was breathtaking, and the widespread use of coal was utterly unprecedented. Marco Polo's accounts sparked immense excitement and controversy in Europe. Many dismissed him as a liar, as the East he described seemed too magnificent to fit within the bounds of European imagination. Yet his narrative planted a seed, a deep-seated longing for the wealth and civilization of the East took root in the hearts of Europeans. The peace established by the Mongols brought not only material and cultural exchanges, but also more covert and deadly consequences of globalization. The cross-continental spread of diseases. The Black Death, which swept through Europe from 1346 to 1353, is believed by many historians to have been transmitted from Central Asia to Europe via the Mongol Empire's trade networks. During the Mongol siege of the Crimean city of Kaffa, it is said that plague-infected corpses were catapulted into the city, possibly marking the earliest recorded use of biological weapons in human history. The plague then spread to Italy and Western Europe through Genoese merchant ships fleeing Kaffa, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population within a few years. The impact of the Black Death was all-encompassing. Labor shortages drove up wages and contributed to the collapse of serfdom. Skepticism toward the Church sowed the seeds of the Reformation, and dramatic demographic shifts propelled the painful transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era. The routes opened by the Mongol Empire transmitted not only silk and knowledge, but also death. Globalization has been a double-edged sword from its very inception. The cross-cultural integration fostered by the Mongol Empire in the realms of art and culture is equally remarkable. In the Persian region under the Ilkhanate, a new painting style emerged. Persian miniature painting began incorporating the compositional techniques and perspective methods of Chinese landscape painting. The introduction of Chinese blue and white porcelain technology to Persia and the Middle East gave rise to a unique local tradition of blue and white ceramics. Architectural techniques and decorative styles introduced by the Mongols from China influenced the design of mosques and mausoleums in Central Asia and Persia. In the field of music, Chinese musical instruments and theories were transmitted to Central and West Asia through the Mongol court. The Mongol Empire's capital, Karakorum, though modest in size, was a stunning kaleidoscope of civilizations. Within this small city, one could find Chinese-style Buddhist temples, Persian-style mosques, European-style Christian churches, and Mongol shamanic altars standing side by side. The collision and fusion of different civilizations here produced a unique cultural landscape unprecedented in human history. However, while marveling at the achievements of cultural exchange during the Pax Mongolica, we must not overlook a crucial fact. These exchanges were built upon immense human suffering. The Silk Road remained open because all resistance along its path was eradicated by the Mongol armies. Trade flourished because millions of indigenous people were slaughtered or displaced, clearing obstacles for commerce. Cultural integration occurred largely because survivors of destroyed cultural centers had to reorganize their lives within the new frameworks imposed by the conquerors. The Pax Mongolica was not an idyllic golden age, but a forced peace established on the monopoly of absolute violence. History does not allow for simplistic judgments of good or evil. The Mongol Empire was both a great facilitator of cultural exchange and the primary executor of civilizational destruction. These two identities coexist and are inseparable. We may celebrate progress, but we must not let our cheers drown out the voices of those forever silenced. The impact of the Mongol Empire on the world economic system was equally revolutionary. Before the Mongols, long-distance trade across Eurasia existed, but remained an expensive and dangerous luxury. The Mongol Empire significantly reduced the costs of international trade by unifying tariffs, minimizing intermediaries, and ensuring the safety of trade routes, making the long-distance transportation of bulk commodities profitable for the first time. The widespread use of silver as an international means of payment can also be traced back to the Mongol Empire. While the paper currency system promoted by the Mongols disappeared after the empire's collapse, the cross-regional silver circulation network they established endured. China's demand for silver, transmitted through the Silk Road and maritime trade routes to Japan and the Americas, ultimately became a core driving force behind global trade during the Age of Exploration. The global economy has never been a natural product that fell from the sky. Rather, it is a surging torrent formed by countless men, made channels forged through blood and fire. The contributions of the Mongol Empire to the cross-civilizational dissemination of scientific knowledge far exceed common imagination. Under the patronage of the Ilkhanate, the Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi constructed the renowned Marika Observatory. This observatory integrated Chinese observational data, Arabic mathematical methods, and Greek cosmological models to produce the most precise astronomical observations of its time. The mathematical tool invented by al-Tusi, known as the Tusi couple, later appeared in Copernicus's works on heliocentrism. Although the specific transmission path between the two remains debated, the Mongol Empire's knowledge circulation network provided the possibility for such cross-civilizational knowledge transfer. Arabic algebra and trigonometry also reached Europe through Mongol channels, laying the mathematical foundation for the subsequent scientific revolution. Chinese medical knowledge, including acupuncture and herbal medicine, was introduced to Persia and the Middle East via court physicians of the Mongol Empire. Perhaps the most profound historical legacy of the Pax Mongolica lies not in the spread of any specific commodity, technology, or knowledge, but in its fundamental transformation of humanity's perception of the world. Before the rise of the Mongol Empire, the world's major civilizations, the Chinese, Islamic, Christian, and Indian spheres, developed largely independently with extremely limited mutual understanding. Europeans had no idea of China's vastness, the Chinese were unaware of Europe's location, and Arabs possessed only vague hearsay about both. The conquests of the Mongol Empire and the resulting large-scale movement of people, goods, and knowledge connected these isolated civilizations for the first time into an integrated whole, where they became aware of and influenced one another. Marco Polo's travels provided Europeans with their first detailed understanding of China and Japan. Rashid al-Din's Fate Compendium of Chronicles, Fate offered Persians their first systematic account of the histories of the Mongols, Chinese, and Europeans. The world began to shrink, and humanity started to realize it inhabited the same planet. The global connectivity effect of the Mongol Empire directly and profoundly propelled the subsequent age of discovery. When the Mongol Empire began to fragment and disintegrate in the mid-14th century, the Silk Road was disrupted, and European merchants found they could no longer obtain spices, silk, and porcelain from the east via overland routes as they once had. However, the immense demand for Eastern goods, cultivated during the Pax Mongolica, did not disappear. Instead, it grew more urgent due to the supply disruption. The search for new sea routes to the east, the core driving force behind the entire age of discovery, was essentially an effort to reopen the east-west trade channels that the Mongol Empire had once provided, but which closed with its collapse. Columbus's westward voyage aimed not to discover a new continent, but to find a sea route to China and Japan. Vasco da Gama's rounding of the Cape of Good Hope to reach India precisely accomplished the east-west connection that the Mongol Empire had once achieved overland. Of course, we must also acknowledge the limitations and fragility of the Pax Mongolica. This peace was entirely dependent on the formidable military deterrence and relatively unified political authority of the Mongol Empire to sustain it. When the empire's cohesion began to weaken and internal conflicts intensified, the Pax Mongolica rapidly disintegrated. From the late 13th to the early 14th century, wars among the four major khanates became increasingly frequent. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate engaged in decades of fierce conflict in the Caucasus region. The Chagatai Khanate split into eastern and western factions that fought each other, and the Fagati Khanate was annexed by other khanates. Caravans along the Silk Road once again faced threats of warfare and plunder, leading to a sharp decline in transcontinental trade. By the mid-1/4th century, the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity existed in name only. The Pax Mongolica lasted less than a century, a mere blink in the vast expanse of history. After its brief brilliance, a prolonged decline followed. Looking back at the core argument of Chapter 7, the most enduring and profound legacy of the Mongol Empire is not how much land it conquered or how many people it slaughtered, but rather the first wave of globalization in human history, which it inadvertently created after its conquests. The full revival of the Silk Road, the westward spread of gunpowder, printing, and papermaking, the transcontinental transmission of the Black Death, the cross-cultural travels of figures like Marco Polo, the emergence of the concept of world history, and the initial formation of an international trade system. All of these occurred within the brief decades of the Pax Mongolica. Yet their impact on human civilization has persisted for centuries, even to this day. The achievements of the Mongol Empire in construction are as astonishing as its record of destruction. And what is even more thought-provoking is the inseparable causal relationship between the two. Without conquest, there would have been no unification. Without unification, no peace, and without peace, no exchange. This question remains unanswered to this day, and perhaps never will be. The story of the Mongol Empire forces us to confront an eternal paradox in historiography. The forces that drive the greatest progress in human civilization are often also the ones that cause the greatest suffering. This was true of the Roman Empire, the empire of Alexander the Great, and especially the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan could not have, nor did he ever intend to, promote cultural exchange or globalization. Every decision he made was driven by highly pragmatic goals: expanding territory, eliminating threats, acquiring resources, and maintaining order. Yet, the institutional systems he established and the transportation networks he opened up objectively created the conditions for cultural exchange. Once these exchanges began, they generated profound historical effects that far exceeded the intentions and control of any single individual. The irony of history lies in the fact that the greatest builders of civilization may have had no idea they were building it, while the most terrifying destroyers of civilization may have been unaware that they were clearing the way for the birth of a new one. How does a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? Chapter 7 offers an unexpected dimension to the answer. His method of rewriting the world is not merely conquest and rule, but also the unintended grand exchange of civilizations that followed. Though the Pax Mongolica was brief, the globalizing energy it unleashed has continued to shape the world we live in today. From the infant born clutching a blood clot by the Onon River to the screen you are watching this video on, there exists a long chain of causality linked by post stations, trade routes, wars, plagues, discoveries of knowledge, and the lives and deaths of countless individuals. In the next chapter, we will descend from the macro level of civilization to the personal dimension, delving into the man Genghis Khan himself. His character, his beliefs, his contradictions, his understanding of power, and his limitations as a human individual. What kind of person was the man who changed the world? In the first 7 chapters, we have examined Genghis Khan from a macro-historical perspective. His conquests, his institutions, his empire, and his impact on civilization. But what kind of person was the man who changed the face of the entire world? This question is far more difficult to answer than how many battles he won or how much land he conquered. Genghis Khan left no autobiography, nor any documents written in his own hand. He remained illiterate throughout his life. Our understanding of his personal character and inner world comes mainly from 2 highly unreliable sources. One is Fei's Secret History of the Mongols, Fei compiled by the Mongols, which carries a strong heroic epic tone, filled with mythologization and glorification of Genghis Khan. The other is the records of Persian and Arab historians, colored by the fear and hatred of the conquered, tending to portray him as a devil, like scourge from heaven. The real Genghis Khan lies hidden in the intersecting shadows of these 2 extreme narratives. To explore within this uncertainty may itself be the most sincere attitude toward history. Admitting that we do not fully know is closer to the stance of a responsible narrator than pretending to know everything. Nearly all historical records, regardless of their perspective, agree on one key characteristic. Genghis Khan was an extremely pragmatic man. He was neither fanatical nor dismissive of religion, judging all beliefs purely by practical standards. Any religion that could help govern the empire was welcomed, while any religious fervor that hindered its functioning was suppressed without hesitation. His thirst for talent transcended racial and cultural prejudices. Chinese, Khitans, Uyghurs, Persians, and even former enemies were entrusted with important roles as long as they were capable and loyal. When he realized that the Mongols lacked experience in managing urban civilizations, he did not hesitate to extensively employ administrative talents from conquered peoples. Unlike many conquerors who stubbornly insisted on assigning tasks to their own people beyond their capabilities, this calm, almost cold, pragmatism permeated every major decision he made. He was not a visionary with grand ideals, but a problem solver who always focused on addressing immediate practical issues. He demonstrated that in life or death competition, the clearest mind will always prevail over the most fervent belief. Another core trait of Genghis Khan's character, consistently confirmed by all historical records, is his extreme obsession with loyalty. This obsession was not merely a personality preference, but reached an intensity akin to religious faith. In his value system, loyalty was the supreme virtue, and betrayal the only unforgivable sin. He could forgive an enemy who had bravely resisted him on the battlefield, even one who had wounded him. The famous Jeb was pardoned and eventually became one of the empire's greatest generals, precisely because he honestly admitted to firing the arrow that nearly took Genghis Khan's life. However, he would never forgive a traitor who betrayed their former master, even if the betrayal directly aided Genghis Khan himself. When Jamaica was captured and handed over by 5 of his followers, Genghis Khan ordered the execution of those 5 men, rather than rewarding them. A case detailed in earlier chapters. This extreme emphasis on loyalty was not an innate personality trait, but a direct product of childhood trauma. A child abandoned by his entire tribe after his father's death, whose fear and hatred of betrayal were deeply etched into his soul, never to be erased by time or power. Genghis Khan's relationships with women also merit close examination. Bi-Firte was the most important woman in his life. Not only his wife, but also his most trusted political advisor. At several critical historical junctures, it was Bi-Firte's judgment that helped Temujin make the right decisions. When breaking with Jamukha, it was Bi-Firte who first sensed the danger and urged her husband to act immediately. In the early days of empire building, her influence on internal affairs was undeniable. Genghis Khan's feelings for her were exceptional for that polygamous era. Though he later took dozens of wives and concubines, Bi-Firte always retained the highest status as principal wife, and only her sons were eligible to inherit the empire. However, we should not romanticize this relationship. The mystery surrounding Jochi's parentage reveals that Bi-Firte's experiences during her captivity left an unhealed wound in their bond. The succession crisis of the Mongol Empire can largely be traced back to this trauma, which was never openly discussed. The deepest fractures in the closest relationships often stem from the things both parties choose to keep silent about. Genghis Khan's religious outlook is a crucial key to understanding him. He was not a devout follower of any religion, but maintained a deep reverence for supernatural forces, what the Mongols called eternal heaven or Tengri. At critical moments in his life, he would often ascend Mount Burkhan Khaldan, alone, to pray to eternal heaven for guidance. In his worldview, eternal heaven was the supreme ruler of the universe, and he was chosen to carry out its will, to unify the steppes, conquer the world, and establish order. This sense of divine mandate gave him extraordinary confidence and decisiveness. But it also cloaked his atrocities in a chillingly sacred guise, when he declared to the residents of Bukhara that heaven had sent him to punish them. He likely believed it was more than political propaganda. He sincerely thought he was executing the will of heaven. The violence unleashed by a man who believes he is acting on divine orders is far more terrifying and thorough than that of someone driven purely by greed. Because in his eyes, killing is not a sin but a mission. The shadow of this divine mandate consciousness loomed over the entire era of the Mongol Empire's conquests. Perhaps the most striking contradiction in Genghis Khan lies in his simultaneous display of extreme cruelty and extreme generosity. Toward his enemies, especially those he deemed treacherous or challenging to the empire's order, his retribution knew no bounds. The fate of the Khwarezmian Empire, the governor of Otrar, and countless massacred civilians stand as ironclad proof. Yet, toward his followers and loyal subordinates, he exhibited an almost fatherly generosity and care. He remembered every individual who had aided him decades earlier, and repaid them one by one after gaining power. Sorkhan Shira, the herdsman who risked his life to save him when he was captured as a youth, was later granted the privilege of exemption from 9 death sentences, the highest honor unique to the Mongol Empire. His care for his longest serving old ministers came from the heart, not merely as political appeasement. This coexistence of extreme cruelty and extreme generosity is not contradictory. They both point to the same core logic, giving everything to the loyal and showing no mercy to the treacherous. His world was a binary one of black and white. You were either his most cherished ally or his most ruthless target, with no gray area in between. As a military commander, Genghis Khan's most outstanding ability was not his personal martial prowess or tactical brilliance, but his talent for identifying and utilizing capable individuals. He almost never personally led charges into battle. After becoming the Great Khan, his role resembled that of a chief architect and coordinator, rather than a frontline commander. His greatest military talent lay in his ability to find the right people for the right positions and then grant them full trust and authority. Jabe was assigned to carry out the boldest flanking raids because Genghis Khan knew he possessed the ability and courage to make independent decisions under extreme conditions. Subutai was entrusted with the actual military command of the Western campaigns because Genghis Khan judged him to have the most far-reaching strategic vision. Mukhali was authorized to independently manage the Chinese battlefield because Genghis Khan trusted his loyalty and understood his comprehensive ability to handle complex situations. This talent for recognizing and employing capable individuals can be found in all great leaders. Alexander had Hephaestion, Liu Bang had Han Xin, and Napoleon had Davout. However, Genghis Khan may have been the most exceptional in this regard, because he faced a most limited talent pool. There were no military academies or established talent selection mechanisms on the steppes. According to various historical records, Genghis Khan's personal lifestyle was remarkably simple. Even after becoming the ruler of the most powerful empire, he maintained the modest ways of a nomadic people, living in felt tents rather than palaces, eating hand-torn meat instead of elaborate feasts, and wearing leather robes rather than luxurious silk garments. Multiple sources mention his deep aversion to excessive drinking. Although he was not a teetotaler himself, he repeatedly warned his generals and descendants against indulging in alcohol, having witnessed too many grassland heroes lose their judgment and meet their downfall due to overindulgence. This restraint was not a mere performance, but an instinctive wariness toward material comforts from a man who grew up in extreme scarcity. He knew the taste of hunger and cold all too well and understood that comfort and luxury were more dangerous than any enemy. Ironically, this warning was not heeded by his descendants. His son Fegedi was a notorious heavy drinker and likely died young due to excessive alcohol consumption. His grandson Ji-Fike was similarly addicted to alcohol and died of a sudden illness after less than 2 years on the throne. His successors learned his methods of conquering the world, but forgot his discipline of self-restraint. The shift in Genghis Khan's mindset in his later years is noteworthy. Yet, it is difficult to precisely verify from historical records. There are indications that in the final years of his life, he began to contemplate death with increasing depth and anxiety. As previously mentioned, he summoned the Taoist master Chu Chuji to inquire about the secrets of immortality. According to dialogues recorded by Chu Chu's disciples, Genghis Khan not only sought the path to longevity, but also discussed principles of governance and philosophical questions about the way of heaven and human nature. Chu Chuji candidly told him that there was no elixir for eternal life, but one could prolong life by restraining desires, purifying the mind, and reducing bloodshed. If historical accounts are accurate, this dialogue between a conqueror who had razed countless cities and a Taoist advocating tranquility and non-action might suggest that Genghis Khan, in the final stage of his life, finally began to realize that violence and conquest could not answer the ultimate questions about the meaning of life. He could conquer the world, but he could not conquer death. This realization must have been profoundly painful for a man who had spent his entire life solving problems through violence, because it meant he was ultimately facing an opponent against whom all his power and might were powerless. There are many imaginative depictions of Genghis Khan's appearance in later generations, but reliable contemporary records are extremely scarce. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din mentioned in his compendium of chronicles that he was tall, with a broad forehead and a long beard. The most striking detail is that he was said to have cat-like green eyes, a feature extremely rare among Mongols, and considered a sign of a person destined by heaven. The secret history of the Mongols does not directly describe his appearance, but through indirect details it can be inferred that he was physically robust and energetic, able to ride horses, hunt, and command military operations, even in his later years. All the portraits and sculptures of Genghis Khan we see today are products of later imagination, with none based on sketches from life. The most commonly seen so-called portrait is actually an idealized image created by court painters of the Yuan dynasty, based on the common features of the Mongol royal family and imagination. In the painting housed in the National Palace Museum in Taipei, he is depicted as a middle-aged man with a round face and deep gaze. But this differs significantly from Rashid al-Din's description of a tall, long-bearded man with gray-green eyes. The relationship between Genghis Khan and his four sons constitutes one of the most dramatic and poignant family narratives in imperial history. The eldest son, Jochi, and the second son, Chagatai, harbored a long-standing enmity. Chagatai openly questioned Jochi's lineage, calling him the seed of the Merkits, which in Mongol culture was tantamount to declaring him unworthy of being considered Genghis Khan's son. The third son, Fegedi, was gentle and amiable, but lacked military sharpness, while the youngest son, Tolui, most resembled his father, possessing both military talent and political acumen. However, due to his status as the youngest, tradition dictated that he could only guard the family's inheritance. Genghis Khan's attitude toward his four sons was exceedingly complex. As a father, he loved each one, but as an emperor, he coolly assessed each son's abilities and flaws. He chose Fedi as his successor, not because he was the most outstanding, but because he was the only one among the four who would not provoke the united opposition of the other three. This was the rational calculation of an emperor. Yet, even such meticulous arrangements could not prevent the empire from descending into division. Jochi died of illness a few months before his father's passing. The superficial harmony between Chagatai and Fegei was only temporarily maintained by their father's prestige, and Tolui's descendants ultimately overthrew the Fegedii line, triggering a full-scale civil war. The greatest challenge in evaluating Genghis Khan's character lies in how to address the extreme moral duality within him. He was a man of his word, but only within the rule system he defined for himself. His rewards for loyalty were sincere and generous. Yet, the violence he inflicted upon those he categorized as disruptors of order was equally sincere and unhesitating. He was not a hypocrite, never feigning benevolence or using lofty words to whitewash atrocities. When he vowed to destroy a city, he followed through. When he promised to protect an individual, he did so as well. In a sense, he was an exceptionally transparent person, transparent to a terrifying degree. Although his moral framework differed vastly from modern civilized standards, it was internally consistent, complete, and even rigorous in its own right. Understanding him does not mean endorsing him, but rather acknowledging that, behind his actions, lay a complete logic and value system, not merely savage, bestial impulses. Such understanding is essential for any serious historical reflection. Reducing complex historical figures to pure good or pure evil is not an act of comprehending history, but of evading it. Genghis Khan possessed a frequently overlooked yet crucial quality. He was an exceptional learner. His life was a continuous process of learning and evolving from failures and his environment. During his childhood, abandoned by his tribe, he learned the fragility of human loyalty and the importance of systems. From the devastating defeat in the Battle of the 13 Wings, he realized that winning hearts mattered more than military strength. From the civilizations he conquered, he absorbed knowledge of writing, administration, siege techniques, and long-distance communication. His ability to embrace new knowledge and tools was unparalleled among rulers of his time. A nomadic leader who had never seen city walls mastered the use of catapults, siege towers, and gunpowder weapons within years, conquering some of the world's most fortified cities. The root of this learning ability lay in his complete lack of the arrogance and prejudice common among civilized people. He did not believe anything was inherently superior or inferior, judging everything solely by its usefulness. This raw pragmatism made him one of history's most efficient cross-cultural learners. Perhaps the greatest limitation of Genghis Khan as an individual lay in his complete inability or unwillingness to comprehend the intrinsic value of the civilizations he destroyed. To him, cities were merely targets to be conquered, or reservoirs of wealth and talent to be exploited. He could not appreciate the architectural beauty of the mosques in Bukhara, nor understand what the Greek philosophical manuscripts housed in Baghdad's House of Wisdom meant for the history of human thought. He protected artisans and scholars because they were useful, capable of forging weapons, translating documents, or administering cities. Yet he lacked any instinctive resonance with the pursuit of pure knowledge, the creation of pure art, or the exploration of pure spirit. This limitation was not his personal failing, but a natural blind spot of the culture from which he came. A man raised on the steppes, his cognitive framework was built around survival and conquest, leaving no room for beauty and wisdom that did not yield immediate practical value. This is why, despite reaching unprecedented heights in military and political organization, the Mongol Empire always relied on the contributions of conquered peoples for cultural creation. Throughout Genghis Khan's long and legendary life, loneliness may have been a constant yet rarely discussed theme. From the bone-chilling solitude of being abandoned by his tribe in childhood, to the survivalist isolation of struggling on the grasslands in his youth. From the loneliness of power, surrounded by followers, yet understood by none. After becoming the great Khan, to the ultimate solitude of facing death in old age. A burden no one could bear for him. Loneliness flowed like an underground river beneath all the glory of his life, never ceasing. In his entire life, perhaps only two could be considered his spiritual equals: his sworn brother Jamukha and his wife Bifurti. Yet Jamukha ultimately became an enemy he had to destroy. And though Bifurti remained by his side, the unbridgeable chasm of the mystery surrounding Jochi's lineage forever stood between them. At the pinnacle of his empire, Genghis Khan was, at his core, a lonely man, a solitary decision maker, a solitary bearer of burdens, a solitary climber to the summit. Perhaps it was this deep-seated loneliness that drove him to ceaselessly expand and conquer. For a soul that could never find peace within could only seek fleeting calm in unending action. Historians often face an eternal dilemma when evaluating Genghis Khan. Praising his institutional innovations and historical impact seems akin to justifying mass slaughter, while condemning his atrocities appears to overlook his objective contributions to the course of civilization. This dilemma itself may be a false premise. We can fully acknowledge two truths simultaneously. Genghis Khan was one of the greatest institutional designers and most efficient military organizers in human history, while also being directly responsible for the wartime devastation that claimed the lives of millions, possibly even tens of millions, of innocent civilians. These two identities do not need to cancel each other out or be balanced against one another. The fact that they coexist in the same individual is itself the most profound lesson history offers us. Greatness cannot absolve evil, nor can evil erase greatness. Any attempt to reduce Genghis Khan to a pure hero or a pure demon betrays the complexity of history. The discomfort brought by this complexity, the cognitive anguish of being unable to fully accept or fully reject, is precisely the price we must pay for taking history seriously. Perhaps the best way to understand Genghis Khan is not to look down on him from a moral high ground, nor to gaze up at him from the perspective of an admirer, but to stand on the same grassland where he once stood and meet him eye to eye. To see a human individual born into the harshest of environments, responding to fate with every cognitive resource and survival instinct at his disposal. His greatness and his terror are rooted in the same soil, the very grassland that abandoned him and was later conquered by him. He received no ethical education, no religious prophet told him that killing was a sin, and no philosopher guided him to ponder the meaning of justice. His entire moral system was derived from the most primitive survival laws of the steppe: protect your own people and eliminate threats. With this code, he built the largest empire in human history and also created the greatest tragedy on a human scale. He was a product of his time and his environment, a human specimen forged to the extreme under the most extreme conditions. How does a person abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? Chapter 8 attempts to answer this central question that runs through the entire film from a personal perspective. The answer is, this person is neither a born demon nor a chosen saint. He is an extreme individual forged by extreme circumstances. Childhood trauma instilled in him an extreme obsession with loyalty, an extreme hatred for betrayal, and an extreme longing for order. The survival laws of the steppe gave him a cold, pragmatic spirit and the ability to use violence without hesitation. His faith in the eternal blue sky granted him confidence beyond ordinary people, and a drive akin to a sense of mission. His innate intelligence and learning ability allowed him to draw nourishment from every failure, every enemy, and every civilization, constantly evolving. These elements combined to create an individual never before seen in human history. A person who simultaneously possesses the ferocity of a steppe wolf, the vision of a lawmaker, the foresight of an emperor, and the insatiable curiosity of a perpetual learner. The traces left by the wind may be covered by new grass, but the steppe itself has been forever changed. In the year 1227, Genghis Khan closed his eyes for the last time on the desolate plains of the Western Sha. What he left behind was not only a vast empire spanning Europe and Asia, but also an ultimate, seemingly unsolvable puzzle. How could a system built around the personal will and prestige of its founder continue to function after his disappearance? In his lifetime, he made meticulous arrangements, designating a successor, dividing territories among his sons, establishing the 1,000-household system, and the great Yasa to ensure the continuity of the system. Yet what he could neither foresee nor control were the most fundamental weaknesses of human nature: jealousy, greed, lust for power, and the suspicions born of blood ties. These weaknesses could be suppressed while a strong leader lived. But once that restraining force vanished, they erupted with redoubled intensity. The Mongol Empire's decline from its zenith to fragmentation was not the fault of any single individual or the outcome of any particular war, but an almost inevitable historical process. For humanity has yet to find a perfect solution to the peaceful transfer of power. Genghis Khan could design the world's most efficient war machine, but he could not design a system to ensure eternal unity among his descendants. The decline of an empire never begins suddenly on a single day. It is destined from the moment the founder takes his last breath. For that one, of a kind individual is gone forever. Fagedi formally ascended as the designated heir in 1229, becoming the second great Khan. His reign appeared to be another glorious era for the empire. The Jin dynasty was completely annihilated. Mongol armies swept across Eastern Europe, and the empire's territory reached unprecedented extents. Fagedi himself was not without talent. He built the first true capital, Karakorum, on the steppe, implemented administrative reforms to strengthen central governance, and vigorously supported commerce, driving Silk Road trade to new heights. However, beneath these surface achievements, cracks were already emerging. Fagedi was a heavy drinker, and his health deteriorated over time, with many of his decisions overly influenced by his favored courtiers. While his control over the various khanates remained, it was not as absolute as that of Genghis Khan. More critically, he failed to make clear and decisive arrangements regarding his successor. Fagedi reigned for 12 years and died in late 1241. His death directly led to the withdrawal of the Mongol Western Expeditionary Forces, which had been advancing triumphantly through Europe. The death of one man saved a continent. This irony precisely exposed a fatal flaw of the Mongol Empire. When everything depended on the Great Khan, his disappearance meant everything came to a halt. Genghis Khan's system ensured the empire's invincibility on the battlefield. But it failed to address a more fundamental question: how to keep the empire running stably in the absence of the Great Khan. After Fagedi's death, the empire experienced its first serious succession crisis. According to his will, his grandson Shiren Fein was supposed to succeed him. But Empress Tifei-Regine, acting as regent, held power for 5 years, during which the empire's administrative efficiency sharply declined, and governance across the regions fell into chaos. In 1246, the Kurultai elected not Shiren Fein but Jifei-Kei, Fagedi's eldest son, after ascending to the throne. Jifei-Kei developed intense conflicts with Batu, the ruler of the Golden Horde, and their hostility reached a point of nearly erupting into open warfare. However, Jifei-Kei died suddenly of a severe illness during a military campaign just a year and a half after his accession, with most scholars suspecting his death was linked to excessive drinking and indulgence. His sudden demise temporarily averted a full-scale civil war but deepened the crisis. 2 successive Great Khans had died in an extremely short period without confirmed successors. The center of power wobbled dangerously, like a spinning top without an axis. Genghis Khan's system was unparalleled in military conquest, but had a fatal design flaw in power succession. The Kurultai election mechanism often devolved into a battleground for factional struggles, rather than a platform for rationally selecting leaders. Every time a Great Khan died, it was not an orderly transfer of power, but a high-stakes political gamble, where all ambitious contenders entered the fray simultaneously. In 1251, a decisive shift occurred in the imperial power center. Amenphekli, the eldest son of Tolui, was elected as the full-oath Great Khan with the strong support of Batu. This marked the transfer of supreme power from the Feigai lineage to the Tolui lineage. The transition was fraught with bloodshed. After ascending to the throne, Mfk carried out a large-scale purge of opposition forces within the Fagedi and Chagatai lines. Numerous princes and nobles were arrested, executed, or exiled, marking the first major political purge within the empire, and the complete collapse of the facade of family unity. Mfega himself was exceptionally capable. He restored administrative efficiency, implemented reforms, cracked down on corruption, and continued external expansion. He dispatched his brother Kublai to attack the southern Song and another brother, Hulagu, to lead a western expedition to the Middle East, targeting Baghdad. Had Mfeki ruled for a longer period, the empire might have had a chance to consolidate once more, but fate once again proved that human lifespan was the empire's most uncontrollable variable. In 1259, Mfekenke died in battle at the foot of Daoyu Fortress in Sichuan, while attacking the southern Song front. A small mountain fortress, through tenacious resistance, killed the Mongol Great Khan and profoundly altered the course of world history. Mfeki's death demonstrated a thought-provoking truth. Even the world's most powerful empire could be forever redirected by a single stone thrown from a city wall. The death of Memphi triggered the most severe civil war in the empire's history. The struggle for the throne between Kublai Khan and Arik Bifeki. Kublai, who had long been stationed in northern China and was deeply influenced by Han culture, represented the faction inclined towards settled civilization and Sinicization. Arik Bifeki, who remained in the Mongolian homeland, represented the conservative faction that adhered to nomadic traditions and opposed Han influence. Both declared themselves Great Khan almost simultaneously. Kublai in Kaiping and Arik B. Finki in Karakoram, each convening a Kurultai, leading to a situation where two Khans coexisted within the empire. This was followed by a full-scale civil war that lasted 4 years. Kublai ultimately defeated Arik B. Finki with his superior economic and military resources. However, the damage caused by this civil war extended far beyond the battlefield. The Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate both refused to recognize Kublai's legitimacy because his ascension did not follow the traditional Kurultai process. From this moment on, the Mongol Empire as a unified political entity effectively came to an end. Thereafter, the so-called empire was merely a nominal suzerain, vassal relationship maintained among several independent and even mutually hostile khanates. The Mongol tribes unified by Genghis Khan in his lifetime fractured, again, less than 40 years after his death, this time permanently. Unity is never a natural state, but an artificial construct that requires immense energy to sustain continuously. Kublai Khan's victory in securing the throne fundamentally altered the nature of the empire. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Dadu, present-day Beijing, establishing the Yuan dynasty and declaring himself not only the Great Khan of the Mongols, but also the Emperor of China. He extensively adopted Chinese political institutions and administrative systems, appointing Han Chinese and semi-officials to govern the empire with Confucian principles. To the traditionalist Mongols, this was almost tantamount to betrayal. How could the Great Khan abandon the ancestral steppes, reside in Chinese cities, and rule in the Chinese manner? From the perspective of the Mongol homeland and the other khanates, Kublai was no longer the leader of all Mongols, but merely a foreign emperor of China. This rupture in perception accelerated the empire's fragmentation. The Golden Horde grew increasingly independent in Eastern Europe. The Chagatai Khanate established its own political order in Central Asia, and the Il Khanate developed a highly Persianized court culture in Persia. Each Khanate was gradually assimilated by the civilizations it ruled, while the common language among them, the traditions of the Mongol steppes and the legacy of Genghis Khan, grew increasingly faint over time. The 4 great khanates were like 4 drops of ink falling into 4 cups of differently colored water. They temporarily altered the color of the water, but ultimately, each drop was diluted and absorbed by the surrounding liquid until it dissolved completely, never to be separated again. After the division of the Mongol Empire, the 4 khanates each embarked on distinctly different paths, which in itself serves as a thought-provoking experiment in civilization. The Golden Horde, ruling over the Eastern European steppes and the Rusis region, gradually underwent Islamization. Its rule profoundly shaped the Russian national character. Centralized authority, obedience to authority, and an obsession with vast territories, all of which later became core features of the Russian Empire and can be traced back to the Mongol period. The Chagatai Khanate, controlling Central Asia, gradually lost its Mongol cultural identity amid the dual processes of Turkification and Islamization, eventually splitting into eastern and western parts. The Il Khanate, ruling over Persia and the Middle East, became the most culturally accomplished branch of the Mongol Empire. Under the patronage of Mongol rulers, Persian literature, art, and science experienced an astonishing revival, with Rashid al-Din's Fey Compendium of Chronicles Fey and the Marrakech Observatory both emerging during this period. The Yuan dynasty established a multi-ethnic empire in China that integrated Mongol, Han, and various other cultures, fostering the flourishing development of popular literature, such as drama and novels. The 4 khanates were like seeds scattered from the same tree, each taking root in different soils and growing into trees of entirely different forms. The conqueror's blade will eventually rust, but the cultural roots of the conquered will sink deeper and deeper into the ruins. The rise and fall of the Yuan dynasty is the most dramatic chapter in the story. During Kublai Khan's reign, the empire reached its peak. The conquest of the southern Song was completed, unifying all of China for the first time under a northern nomadic regime. 2 expeditions to Japan, though thwarted by typhoons, demonstrated unprecedented maritime ambition. The construction of Dadu and the dredging and expansion of the Grand Canal connected the northern and southern economies more closely than ever before. However, signs of decline were already evident in his later years. Continuous failed expeditions drained immense national resources. Excessive issuance of paper currency led to severe inflation, and tensions between the Mongol ruling class and the Han Chinese grew increasingly sharp. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty entered a period of chaos and decline. Imperial succession was frequent, with 9 emperors in just 40 years, none ruling stably for more than a decade. Political corruption was rampant, natural disasters occurred frequently, and the suffering of the common people reached an unbearable breaking point. The Red Turban Rebellion spread like wildfire. And from among the masses, a poor monk from Fangyang, Anhui, Zhu Yuanzhang, quietly rose to prominence. History completed a lamentable cycle here. Over a century earlier, an orphan from the Mongolian steppes had overthrown the old order and established a new empire. Now, another destitute youth from the lowest rungs of society was about to overthrow the empire built by his descendants. The legend of the steppe orphan ended, ironically, at the hands of another orphan. In 1368 AD, Zhu Yuanzhang led the Ming army into Dadu, forcing Togun Tem Fair, the last emperor of the Yuan dynasty, to flee north in panic and retreat to the grasslands. This scene is filled with a cruel historical symmetry. Just over 160 years earlier, Mongol cavalry had swept down from the north to conquer China, only to be driven back to the grasslands by the rising power of the Han people from the south. Mongol rule in China ended in disgrace. From a broader perspective, the fall of the Yuan dynasty was not merely a change of regime, but also marked the loss of the last core territory with substantial unity in the empire. Although the northern Yuan regime, which retreated to the grasslands, continued to bear the title of Great Khan, it effectively reverted to the pre-Genghis Khan state of tribal alliances, fragmented, plagued by internal strife, and too weak to pose any substantial military threat to neighboring civilizations. The Mongols built the largest empire in history in less than 100 years, only to lose almost all of it in less than 150 years. The speed of their rise was astonishing, and the swiftness of their decline is equally thought-provoking. History granted the Mongol Empire a window of only a little over 200 years. Yet during that time, it unleashed enough energy to reshape the world for centuries, even millennia, to come. The empire's disappearance was not a loud crash, but a long sigh. It sank slowly into the depths of time. Yet, the waves it stirred continue to lap against every shore of the world to this day. The other 3 khanates followed distinct paths of decline. Yet their outcomes were strikingly similar. Each was ultimately replaced by forces better adapted to the local environment. The Golden Horde gradually disintegrated in the 15th century, splintering into smaller khanates such as Kazan and Crimea, which were eventually annexed, one by the rising Grand Duchy of Moscow. Although the Mongols left a profound imprint on Eastern Europe during their 2 centuries of rule, the rulers themselves dissolved into the lands they governed. The Chagatai Khanate was supplanted by the Timurid Empire in the 14th century. While Timur claimed to be a successor of Genghis Khan, his empire had become fully Turkicized and Islamicized in culture. In the Ilkhanate, Mongol rulers converted to Islam in the early 14th century, and by the mid-century, the Khanate fragmented into various Persian regional powers. The decline of each Khanate tells the same story: the military superiority of nomadic conquerors is temporary, while the cultural assimilative power of conquered civilizations is enduring. Complex sedentary civilizations possess a far stronger cultural appeal and assimilative capacity than simple nomadic cultures. Once conquest is complete, this force operates irreversibly. Conquerors are like fire, capable of consuming everything in an instant. But sedentary civilizations are like water. Water may be evaporated by fire, yet given enough time and sources, it will always gather again, while fire ultimately extinguishes when its fuel runs out. What are the fundamental reasons for the decline of the Mongol Empire? Several key threads are clearly visible. First, the inherent flaw in the succession system. The Kurultai election was theoretically democratic, but in practice, each transfer of power was accompanied by intense factional struggles and even civil wars. Genghis Khan's prestige could suppress conflicts, but none of his descendants possessed comparable authority. Second, the empire's scale was too vast, exceeding the limits of effective management given the communication and administrative technologies of the time. Even with the postal relay system, an order from Dadu to the Golden Horde could take months, inevitably leading to increasingly loose central control over the frontiers. Third, the irreconcilable structural conflict between nomadic and settled civilizations. The Mongol military advantage was built on the archery skills and mobility forged by nomadic life. But the need to govern settled civilizations gradually forced the Mongols to abandon nomadism and adopt a settled lifestyle, thereby losing their core competitive edge. Fourth, and most fundamentally, Genghis Khan's personal genius was irreplicable. His institutions could be passed down and his laws could endure, but his insight into human nature, his intuition in crises, and the charisma that inspired his followers to willingly sacrifice their lives could not be replicated through institutions. Amid the decline of empires, there is an easily overlooked yet crucial turning point. The Black Death pandemic that swept across Eurasia from 1347 to 1353. This deadliest plague in human history not only killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, but also dealt devastating blows to various khanates. The core regions of the Golden Horde saw a sharp decline in population, economic collapse, and a drastic reduction in military strength. The Ilkhanate, already on the verge of disintegration before the Black Death, saw its downfall accelerated by the plague. The cities and trade networks of the Chagatai Khanate were also severely damaged. Commerce along the Silk Road shrank significantly due to the plague and social chaos, dealing a fatal blow to the transcontinental trade system of the Pax Mongolica. Ironically, the plague spread precisely through the trade networks opened by the Mongol Empire. One of its greatest achievements became a conduit for its accelerated demise. The Mongols connected the world, and this connection, while transmitting wealth and knowledge, also transmitted destruction. The first great experiment in globalization ended with a global catastrophe as its darkest footnote. This serves as the earliest and most painful lesson for all subsequent promoters of globalization. Connecting the world means exposing every corner to risks from any direction. The decline of empires offers profound lessons on the relationship between systems and individuals. Genghis Khan was the greatest institutional designer. His innovations, like the 1,000-household system, the Great Yasa, the postal relay stations, and the Keshik Guard, were revolutionary. Yet, even such an outstanding system proved fragile when faced with a power vacuum following the founder's death. The reason lies in a fundamental blind spot in his system. It relied excessively on the personal ability and prestige of the supreme leader to function. The loyalty of the 1,000 household commanders was ultimately to the great Khan himself, not to an abstract institution. The enforcement of the Great Yasa stemmed from the Great Khan's iron fist in punishing violators, rather than from a spirit of rule of law independent of power. When the Great Khan was strong, the system operated flawlessly, but once his authority was questioned, the entire structure teetered. This is the common weakness of all systems sustained by personal authority. Their upper limit is determined by the leader's capabilities, and their lower limit by the leader's flaws. Truly enduring systems are not designed around a single great individual, but around how to constrain and replace incompetent leaders. The Mongol Empire excelled in the former aspect, but was almost entirely lacking in the latter. The highest ideal of institutional design is not to enable good people to perform better, but to ensure that even bad people cannot cause too much damage. However, we should not be too harsh in criticizing the institutional flaws of the Mongol Empire. Because the peaceful transfer of power is one of the oldest and most difficult challenges in human political history. And even today, no system claims to have perfectly resolved it. The Roman Empire also repeatedly descended into civil war due to succession crises. Each dynastic change in China was accompanied by massive bloodshed. Even modern democratic systems often face tense disputes during power transitions. For Genghis Khan to design the Kurultai, a succession mechanism incorporating elements of election and consultation, on the Mongolian steppes in the 13th century was a remarkable feat of political wisdom. The issue was not that the system was inadequate, but that the challenge was too immense. Achieving orderly succession in an empire spanning half the globe, with hundreds of languages spoken and 5 or 6 religions practiced, was a task far beyond the capabilities of any 13th century politician. The Mongol Empire did not decline because the Mongols were foolish, but because the endeavor they attempted, unifying and governing the entire Eurasian continent, exceeded the limits of the technological and institutional conditions of that era. They were not defeated by their enemies, but by distance, by time, and by the ceiling of human organizational capacity. Although the empire existed in name only as a unified political entity after the mid-1/4th century, the name and legacy of Genghis Khan held far greater influence on the steppes than the empire's lifespan. For centuries after the empire's fall, countless political forces across Central and North Asia sought legitimacy by claiming descent from Genghis Khan, though not a direct descendant. Timur married a woman from Genghis Khan's family and used the title of son-in-law throughout his life to lend legitimacy to his conquests. Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, was a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, using this dual lineage as a legitimate source for ruling India. Even in the Mongolian homeland, descent from the Golden Family remained a prerequisite for claiming the title of Khan until the 17th century. No matter how talented or powerful one was, without the blood of Genghis Khan, one could never be elected as the Great Khan. This veneration of lineage persisted for over 400 years, far outlasting the empire itself. Though Genghis Khan's physical body turned to dust long ago, his name and bloodline became the political currency of the entire Inner Asian world, a symbol of power more enduring and precious than gold or silver. A person's biological existence lasts only a few decades, but their symbolic presence can endure for centuries or longer. To this day, his name remains synonymous with strength and will. How does a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? Chapter 9 reveals the most poignant scene of this story. He did indeed rewrite the world, but what he rewrote did not endure forever as he intended. The process of the Mongol Empire's rise and fragmentation proves a brutal historical truth. Nothing created by humanity is eternal, no matter how invincible it may seem at its inception. Genghis Khan's life demonstrated the incredible heights that individual will can reach. An orphan from the steppes could conquer half the world, but the history after his death revealed the other side of individual will. It cannot be inherited, replicated, or sustained indefinitely. An empire can be passed down to one's sons, but the genius that created it cannot. Laws can be inscribed on parchment, but the prestige that gives them power cannot. Systems can be codified into statutes, but the soul that makes them function cannot. The rise and fall of the Mongol Empire resembles a perfect parabola, unstoppable in its ascent and irreversible in its decline. The peak of this parabola coincides precisely with the moment Genghis Khan closed his eyes. This story deserves to be told and remembered, for it speaks not only to the rise and fall of empires, but also to the eternal question of human capability and limitation. We have finally reached the end of this long journey. From the infant born clutching a clot of blood by the Onon River in Chapter 1 to the empire, slowly sinking into the river of time in Chapter 9, we have told one of the most incredible stories in human history across 10 chapters. Now is the time to stand at a higher vantage point. Look back on the entire journey and examine the eternal lessons this story leaves us with. From a final perspective, what kind of man was Genghis Khan? What kind of empire was the Mongol Empire? What does this history mean for us today? There are no simple answers to these questions. If there were, we wouldn't have needed 10 chapters to tell the story. But after the groundwork laid in the previous 9 chapters, we at least have enough facts and perspectives to attempt our own judgments. The best historical narrative does not give the audience a ready-made conclusion, but provides them with enough material to think and judge for themselves. This final chapter is an invitation for you and me to stand on the other side of 800 years and re-examine everything that happened on those grasslands. Let us begin. Let us first return to the core proposition initially raised in this series: how those abandoned by the world rewrote it through order and violence. This theme runs through all 10 chapters, and now we can see its complete form. Tem Fajin's childhood experiences, his father being poisoned, his tribe abandoning him, and his family struggling to survive on the steppe, are not merely a tragic personal story, but the key to understanding everything that followed. The trauma of abandonment instilled in him, and extreme obsession with loyalty, which was ultimately institutionalized as the core spirit of the 1,000 household system and the Great Yasa. The experience of deprivation gave him an extreme longing for order, driving him to establish the most sophisticated military, administrative system in human history. Meanwhile, the survival wisdom learned from the law of the jungle on the steppe endowed him with a ruthlessly pragmatic mindset, unbound by any emotion, bias, or ideology, always choosing the most advantageous course of action for the present situation. A person who has been utterly rejected by the world holds no reverence for its existing order, allowing him to unhesitatingly overthrow and rebuild everything. This power can both create and destroy, and Genghis Khan accomplished both. Genghis Khan's first legacy to the world lies in the realm of institutions. He demonstrated a startling truth: the power of institutional innovation can far surpass that of technological advancement and resource advantages. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Mongols possessed no technological superiority. They lacked advanced metallurgy, gunpowder weapons, siege engines, or shipbuilding capabilities. All they had were horses, bows, and arrows, and the equestrian archery skills forged on the steppes. Yet, through the 1,000 household system, Genghis Khan organized these simple elements into an unprecedented and precise war machine. Through the Great Yasa, he instilled iron discipline into this machine. The postal relay system endowed it with information transmission capabilities far beyond its time, while the Keshik trained a cadre of elite managerial talent. These institutional innovations enabled a nomadic people with a population of less than 2 million to conquer settled civilizations, with hundreds of millions of inhabitants within half a century. This case offers an enduring lesson to all future organizers and institutional designers. What often determines the outcome of competition is not the resources you possess, but how you organize and utilize them. Genghis Khan's second legacy lies in the realm of geopolitics. The conquests of the Mongol Empire fundamentally reshaped the political landscape of the entire Eurasian continent. and their influence remains clearly visible to this day. Russia's national character, its obsession with centralization, its desire for vast territories, and its conflicted identity between Europe and Asia, can largely be traced back to over 2 centuries of Mongol rule. The political landscape of the Middle East was permanently altered when the Mongols destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. China's political geography was redefined as the Yuan dynasty brought regions like Tibet and Yunnan under the direct control of the central government. For the first time, the political boundaries and ethnic distribution patterns that emerged in Central Asia after the dissolution of the Mongol Empire persisted into the modern era. Even the historical trajectories of the Korean Peninsula and Southeast Asian nations were profoundly influenced by the expansion of the Mongol Empire. The political map of the world we live in today bears too many lines that were first drawn by the hooves of Mongol cavalry 8 centuries ago. History is not the past, but an ongoing process. Events that occurred 800 years ago continue to shape our lives in ways we may not even realize. The third legacy is perhaps the most profound, the legacy of civilizational exchange and globalization. The Mongol Empire created the first truly globalized era in human history. Under the protection of the Pax Mongolica, gunpowder, printing, and papermaking spread from the east to the west, while astronomy and algebra traveled from the west to the east. Various religious ideas, artistic styles, and ways of life flowed freely along an unobstructed superhighway of trade. The direct consequences of this globalization were immense. It provided the crucial knowledge and technological foundation for Europe's Renaissance, scientific revolution, and age of exploration, yet its indirect impact was even more far-reaching. For the first time, it implanted in humanity's collective consciousness the idea that the world is a single entity. Before the Mongol Empire, the world's various civilizations were largely isolated and developed independently. After the Mongol Empire, humanity began to realize that it lived in an interconnected world. Events in distant lands could directly affect their own lives. This shift in perception was more fundamental than the transmission of any specific goods or technologies. Seeds sown unintentionally often endure longer than gardens cultivated with deliberate care. Yet, while enumerating these legacies, we must never allow the brilliance of achievements to overshadow the shadow of suffering. The conquests of the Mongol Empire resulted in one of the largest population losses in human history. Although exact figures remain debated, mainstream historians estimate that the direct and indirect death toll during the entire Mongol conquest may have reached tens of millions. The population of the Khwarezm region in Central Asia plummeted by 70 to 90% after the conquest, and many cities did not recover to their pre-conquest levels for centuries. Northern China also suffered severe population losses during the Mongol, Jin and Mongol Song Wars. The large-scale destruction of irrigation systems in Persia and the Middle East led to vast oases turning into deserts, and the ecological damage from these events persists to this day. Behind these numbers lie countless real human individuals. They had names, families, dreams, and fears. When they perished under the Mongol hooves, they did not know, nor would they have cared, how historians centuries later would evaluate whether their deaths contributed to the progress of civilization. For the deceased, no grand narrative can give meaning to their suffering. How do we make a moral judgment between achievement and suffering? This is perhaps the most difficult intellectual challenge left to us by the historical figure of Genghis Khan. We cannot simply approach this issue with an accounting mindset that balances merits against faults. The value of civilizational progress and the value of innocent lives belong to entirely different categories. There is no exchange rate between them, and they cannot be converted. To argue that Genghis Khan promoted globalization, and therefore the massacres he caused can be forgiven, is as absurd as saying that one can kill indiscriminately to build a road. Conversely, to deny the objective contribution of his institutional innovations to human civilization, because he caused large-scale slaughter, is also intellectually dishonest. Perhaps the most mature attitude is to accept this irreconcilability itself. To accept that a person can simultaneously be a great creator and a terrible destroyer, and to accept that good and evil in history are often entangled and cannot be cleanly separated. This acceptance is not moral indifference, but cognitive honesty. A mind capable of holding both admiration and sorrow is closer to the truth of history than one that can only accommodate a single emotion. The story of Genghis Khan offers a profoundly relevant lesson for today's world. The dialectical relationship between order and violence. The history of the Mongol Empire demonstrates that violence can establish order. The 1,000-household system, the Great Yasa, and the Pax Mongolica were all built upon military conquest and the threat of force. Yet it also proves that an order sustained solely by violence is unsustainable. The Mongol Empire began to fracture less than half a century after its founder's death, and largely disintegrated within 150 years. This lesson is more critical today than ever before, when we witness certain regimes in the world attempting to establish and maintain order through sheer force. We should recall the cautionary tale of the Mongol Empire. Violence can shatter an old order, but it alone cannot serve as a lasting foundation for a new one. Truly enduring order must be built, at least in part, on the voluntary acceptance of the governed, not merely on the fear of violence. The rapid rise and swift decline of the Mongol Empire, together, form a complete chain of evidence for this lesson. Violence may be the midwife of order, but it is not its nanny. Another modern insight from the story of Genghis Khan involves the dual nature of globalization. The first wave of globalization, created by the Mongol Empire, brought both unprecedented prosperity and unprecedented disaster. The Silk Road transmitted knowledge and wealth, but also spread the Black Death. 800 years later, the current wave of globalization we are experiencing exhibits a strikingly similar duality. Global trade and technological exchange have created unprecedented prosperity, yet financial crises, pandemics, and cultural conflicts are also spreading worldwide at an equally unprecedented pace. Did not the speed at which the COVID-19 pandemic spread from a single city to the entire world in 2020 mirror the ancient story of the Black Death traveling along the Silk Road? The experience of the Mongol Empire teaches us that globalization is not an option we can choose to accept or reject. Once the world is connected, this connection inevitably transmits both the good and the bad, and we cannot accept only the good while rejecting the bad. What truly requires reflection is not whether to embrace globalization, but how to mitigate its inevitable costs while enjoying the benefits it brings. Returning to Genghis Khan himself. After 10 chapters of in-depth examination, we can say he was an extremely complex human individual. So complex that no single label can fully capture him. Was he a hero? He indeed climbed from the humblest beginnings to the absolute pinnacle of human power, establishing a system unparalleled in his time. Was he a demon? He directly or indirectly caused the deaths of tens of millions of innocent lives. Was he a genius? His military prowess, political wisdom, and institutional design abilities reached extraordinarily rare heights. Was he a barbarian? His cultural creativity was virtually non-existent, and he destroyed far more civilizational heritage than he created. Each label finds ample factual support, yet each also overlooks equally substantial aspects of his character. Perhaps the closest description to the truth is not a noun but a verb. He was a man who burned himself out completely. He unleashed to the limit all the potential a steppe orphan could possess. Wisdom, courage, perseverance, cruelty, and a maddening thirst for order. This life of total combustion illuminated half the world and scorched the other half. At the end of this documentary, let me turn my gaze to the Mongolian grasslands themselves. Today, on these vast plains, herders still tend to their livestock, horses still gallop across the open fields, and the eternal blue sky still stretches its boundless dome overhead. If you stand by the banks of the Onon River, the birthplace of Genghis Khan, and look around, you will find almost no trace of the empire that once existed. There are no grand ruins, no monuments, no palace remains. The Mongol Empire did not leave behind arenas and aqueducts like the Roman Empire, nor did it leave towering stone structures like China's Great Wall. Everything on the grassland is temporary, mobile, and can be dismantled, packed, and taken away at any moment. This, perhaps, is the deepest metaphor of Mongol civilization. The power from the steppes was never about permanent possession, but rather swept through like the wind. The wind changed everything. Yet it left no shape behind. Genghis Khan's empire was such a fierce gale that lasted for 2 centuries. It rearranged the entire world's landscape and then dissipated back into the grasslands from which it came, leaving behind a forever changed world as the sole proof of its existence. The attitude of Mongolians towards Genghis Khan today is itself a thought-provoking cultural phenomenon. In contemporary Mongolia, Genghis Khan is an undisputed national hero and symbol of the state. His face is printed on banknotes, his name is used for airports, universities, and vodka brands. The international airport is named after him, and a massive seated statue of him stands in the central square of the capital, Ulaanbaatar. For a small country with a population of less than 4 million, Genghis Khan is the most profound mark they have left on world history, and the ultimate source of their national pride. However, in many countries across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, Genghis Khan's name is still associated with destruction and terror. Iranians remember the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire, Arabs recall the sack of Baghdad, and Russians recall the humiliation of the Tatar yoke. The same historical figure wears 2 completely opposite faces in the memories of different civilizations. This in itself is an excellent case for understanding the complexity of history. Whose memory is more real? The answer is that both memories are real. For the Mongols, he was the founding father who established a great empire. For the conquered, he was an invader who brought devastating disaster. If we zoom out further and examine Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire from the scale of the entire history of human civilization, we will discover a deeper theme, the question of the limits of human potential. At its core, the story of Genghis Khan is about how far one person can go. What heights can an individual born under the most adverse conditions, without wealth, status, education, or even a stable family, achieve solely through their own intelligence, willpower, and extreme adaptability to their environment? Genghis Khan provided an answer that astonished everyone. He could conquer half of the known world. This answer is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Awe-inspiring because human potential can indeed reach such incredible heights, and terrifying because the unleashing of this potential was accompanied by immense destruction. Perhaps Genghis Khan's deepest legacy is not any specific institution, trade route, or political structure, but rather the fact that, through his own life, he demonstrated to all of humanity an inspiring yet unsettling truth: human power is far greater than we typically imagine, whether that power is used for creation or destruction. At the end of telling this story, I want to return to the simplest and most fundamental question. Why is this story worth telling? The answer is not merely because it is highly dramatic or because of the grand scale of history it involves. The deeper reason lies in the fact that Genghis Khan's story serves as a mirror. It reflects not only the face of a 13th century Mongol, but also the face of humanity itself. In him, we see humanity's most extreme creativity and its most extreme destructiveness. We see the genius of institutional design and the poverty of moral imagination. We see a profound longing for order and the extreme violence employed to establish it. We see how a person abandoned by the world devoted his entire life to ensuring that the world could never abandon him again. These themes do not belong to the 13th century or to the Mongolian steppes. They belong to all times and to all human beings across civilizations. Everyone struggling to survive in adversity can find resonance in Temujin's childhood. Every organizer attempting to use institutions to combat chaos can find inspiration in the Thousand Household System. Every leader facing the temptations and corruptions of power can find warnings in the decline of the Mongol Empire. How did a man abandoned by the world rewrite it with order and violence? By the end of 10 chapters, we can finally provide a complete answer. He used the trauma of his childhood as fuel, the survival laws of the steppe as a blueprint, an extreme obsession with loyalty as cohesion, the Thousand Household System as an organizational framework, the Great Yasa as a code of conduct, the postal relay system as a neural network, the faith in eternal heaven as a spiritual pillar, and an extremely pragmatic attitude toward talent as an engine of evolution, forging a nomadic people with no written language, no cities, and no technological advantages into a war machine that swept across Eurasia. Then, in the process of conquering the world, this machine inadvertently created humanity's first wave of globalization, promoting the cross-continental spread of technology, knowledge, religion, and disease, profoundly and irreversibly altering the fundamental landscape of world civilization. He achieved all of this, but he also paid the price for it. The loss of tens of millions of lives, the destruction of hundreds of cities, and the permanent disappearance of countless cultural heritages. And in the end, he himself could not escape the common fate of all mortals: death. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through 800 years of time. From the orphan suffering from hunger and cold by the Onon River to the conqueror who shook the entire world. From the intricate gears of the Thousand Household System to the camel bells along the Silk Road. From the flames of Khwarezm to the prosperity of the Pax Mongolica. From the glorious peak of the empire to the destined twilight of its division. Every fragment of this story speaks to the same theme: the power and the limitations of humanity. Genghis Khan's life demonstrated how incredible a single person's achievements can be, while the fate of his empire after his death proved that even the most extraordinary accomplishments cannot be sustained forever. This may be history's ultimate lesson, not about any one person or empire, but about humanity itself. We have the ability to change the world, but we cannot make that change eternal. We can establish order, but we cannot guarantee its permanence. We can conquer everything except time itself. The wind still blows across the steppe. The herds of horses still run. Eternal heaven still watches silently from above. This story has no end, for it speaks not of the past, but of ourselves.